Hello there, my friend. Come in from wherever you are tonight and let the rest of the day fall away for a little while. Because tonight we're walking back almost 500 years into a city that never really stopped moving, not even before the sun came up. A city where women baked the bread, brewed half the ale in every household, traded silk worth more than a knight's armour, and quietly kept entire businesses alive with their names left out of every official book. And somewhere inside all that noise and smoke, one young woman is about to step out of her front door, not knowing she is standing at the edge of choices most of us never think twice about today. Stay close tonight and you will meet her. Before we step into her morning together, let's do our own small ritual first. If stories like this one have ever helped you drift off or made a quiet evening feel a little warmer, maybe think about tapping that subscribe button, leaving a like or dropping a comment below. Only if it truly feels right, never because you have to. And I am curious tonight, where are you listening from and what time is it where you are right now? I make sure to read every comment, even the short ones. Now turn the lights down as low as you can stand them, maybe switch on a fan or some soft background hum, get comfortable under your blanket, and let's begin. London is still dark when she opens her eyes. Not city dark the way we know it now, with orange streetlights leaking through curtains. This is a deeper, older kind of dark, broken only by the faint orange glow of a banked fire 2 floors below, and the far-off low tolling of a church bell counting out an hour. Nobody in her house owns a clock to check. She lies still for a moment, listening to the house creak awake around her, and somewhere past the shutters, a cartwheel groans over cobblestone still slick with the night's cold air. She's somewhere around 17, old enough to work a full day, young enough that her mother still checks whether she has laced her bodice straight. Her family keeps a small shop below their rooms, the kind that sells thread buttons and odd lengths of cloth left over from bigger orders, and every single person in the house, her father, her mother, her 2 younger brothers, and now her work, some part of that trade before the sun has even cleared the rooftops. There is no separate category in her mind called work and home. They are the same small, crowded, coal-scented world, and she has never known anything else. Breakfast, if you want to call it that, is a heel of yesterday's bread and a cup of small beer. The weak, barely alcoholic kind, brewed thin enough for children to drink safely, and she eats it standing up, already half-dressed, while her mother pins a plain linen cap over her hair and mutters something about the weather turning. There is no mirror worth mentioning. There is no soft morning playlist, no warm shower, none of the small comforts we now consider the bare minimum for simply existing before 9 in the morning. And yet she moves through this routine the way you move through yours. Half asleep, a little annoyed at the cold, already thinking about everything the day is going to demand of her, and underneath all of it quietly a small stubborn wish she's never said out loud to anyone, not even her mother. She wants more than anything to be the one who decides what happens to her own 2 hands someday. Downstairs, her father is already arguing softly with a stack of paperwork, the kind of permits and seals that let a shop legally trade in this city. Documents stamped and approved by a company of men who meet somewhere she has never been allowed to enter, in a hall she's not even sure has a door low enough for her to knock on. She watches him for a moment from the bottom of the stairs, and something in her chest tightens just slightly, not quite anger, more like the feeling of pressing your palm flat against a window you already know does not open. Whatever she ends up doing with her life, she's fairly certain it will not involve her own name being stamped on anything official. Not yet, anyway. Though, as you're about to find out tonight, a surprising number of women in this city had already found their own quiet ways around that particular window. By the time she steps outside, the sky has turned the colour of weak tea and Cheapside is already waking up around her. Picture it with me for a moment. Stalls unfolding like paper flowers along both sides of the widest, proudest street in the whole city. Shutters banging open one after another down the row of goldsmiths' shops, gold and silver catching the first grey light before most people have even finished yawning. The smell of yesterday's rain still caught in the wooden gutters, mixed now with wood smoke, fresh bread, wet straw, and something faintly sour drifting from a brewer's tub 2 doors down. A butcher's boy drags a hook of meat past her, whistling something off-key, and somewhere behind him a rooster that clearly has no idea it lives in a city keeps insisting that morning has in fact arrived. Somewhere close, a woman is rolling a heavy wooden barrel out onto the cobblestones with the kind of practice strength that would put most modern gym memberships to shame, muscling it into place before the first customers of the day arrive looking for their morning ale. And here is something that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it. That barrel of ale was not a treat. It was in a very real sense the safest drink in the entire city. The water pulled from London's wells, and the nearby river carried more risk than reward, so ale brewed at low strength and consumed by almost everyone, children included, was simply what you drank to survive the day without getting sick. And the person most often standing over that brewing kettle, testing it, timing it, selling it out of her own front room for a little extra coin, was a woman. No diploma, no license hanging on the wall, just years of trial and error passed down from a mother or an aunt, and an entire street that depended on her getting the recipe right. A few stalls further along, another woman is unpacking a small wooden box lined with cloth, and inside it ribbons. Rows and rows of narrow silk ribbon, some plain, some woven through with thread so fine it catches the early light like something spun by an insect rather than a human hand. She works quickly, laying them out by colour, because within the hour a servant from one of the grand houses further up the street will come looking for exactly the right shade to trim a sleeve, and being ready first is half the business. Our girl slows down just slightly as she passes, the way you slow down outside a shop window you cannot quite afford to walk into yet. We're going to spend real time with women like her a little later tonight, because what she is quietly building behind that little wooden box would surprise you. Tucked into a corner where 2 stools lean against each other, an older woman sits behind a low table, crowded with bundles of dried leaves, small clay jars and roots still crusted with dirt. People stop for her the way people stop for a familiar face at a pharmacy counter. Quiet nods, quick whispered questions, a coin passed over almost without either of them looking down. She has cured more fevers on this street than most trained physicians ever will, and she has never once been allowed to call herself a doctor. Our girl gives her a small, polite bow of the head, the kind you give someone your grandmother clearly respects, and keeps moving. Keep walking with me past a boy dragging a sack of flour twice his size, past 2 men arguing cheerfully over the price of eels, and you will notice something about the clothes moving past you. The colours are not random. A rich dark red or a deep saturated blue usually means money, sometimes even a title, while the woman selling bread in her plain wool. The colour of oatmeal is telling you without saying a single word exactly where she sits, in this city's very rigid pecking order. There were actual laws on the books at the time dictating who was legally allowed to wear which colours and fabrics, which sounds almost comical now, like showing up to work and being told your blazer is above your pay grade. Except back then, wearing the wrong colour in public could really land you in trouble with the law. For a moment the crowd shifts and a woman moves quickly through the gap. It leaves a leather bag slung across her body, her face set in the particular kind of calm you only see in people who have done something difficult so many times that panic no longer helps her, only steadies her. Nobody stops her. Nobody asks where she's going in such a hurry. They simply step aside the way you might for an ambulance today, because everyone recognizes exactly what she carries in that bag and exactly how much trust an entire family has just placed in her 2 hands. We will follow her into that room later tonight as well, Because a job came with a kind of power the church itself rarely handed to any woman, here is the part that tends to catch people off guard the most. For a long time, the popular picture of a woman in this period was fairly simple: quiet indoors, mostly occupied with children, and a cooking fire waiting patiently for her husband to come home. And historians spent decades more or less repeating that picture, mostly because the official records of the time were written by men about men's work for other men to read. But recent research digging through court records, witness statements, and coroners' reports from across the English countryside found something the old picture completely missed. Cleaning, cooking, and childcare made up less than a third of what women were actually doing with their time. The rest went into farming, trading, brewing, selling, negotiating, running households as businesses in their own right. Almost half of the agricultural labour in some regions came from women's hands. The work was always there, spread across every street, just like the one our girl is walking down right now. It simply was not written down because nobody in charge of the writing thought it was worth mentioning. Our girl reaches the end of the street now, right where 4 narrow lanes meet at an awkward angle, and she pauses the way you pause at a crossing when you're not entirely sure which direction to take, even on a street you have walked 1,000 times before. To her left, the sound of the brewer's tub. Ahead, the quiet, careful click of the silkwoman's ribbons being sorted into rows. To her right, disappearing already around a corner, the swift, steady footsteps of the woman with the leather bag. Somewhere further off, a cart loaded with cheese and fresh milk rattles in from the countryside, driven by a farmer's wife who has already been awake for hours. She does not know it yet, standing there in the cold morning air with her basket on her hip, but she is standing at the exact centre of an entire hidden economy, one built almost completely by women for women, and largely erased from the story we were told about this period. And maybe that is the part worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further tonight. We tend to imagine the past as smaller than it actually was, quieter, simpler, as if the women who lived through it had fewer thoughts, fewer ambitions, fewer mornings spent standing exactly where our girl is standing now, caught between what they were allowed to want and what the world in front of them was actually offering. She is not a queen. Nobody will write her name down today or tomorrow or in 100 years from now. And yet everything you are about to see tonight, every trade, every trick, every quiet act of independence, squeezed out of a system never designed to allow it, happened because of women exactly like her. So tell me honestly, if you were standing in her shoes on that cold morning, ribbons on one side, ale on the other, and something far more powerful waiting just around that corner, which direction would pull you in first? Because that is exactly where we are headed next, right now, tonight, following one small box of silk ribbons into the hands of a woman who quietly became rich enough to dress a queen without ever once being allowed to put her own name on the business she built. Let's stay with her for one more moment, the woman with the ribbon box, the one our girl slowed down just slightly to watch, without quite admitting to herself why. Because tucked inside that little wooden box sitting right alongside the ribbons is a piece of financial history most people walk straight past without ever noticing, the same way our girl very nearly did. Here is the strange part, and it is worth sitting up a little under your blankets for. In a country where a married woman legally owned almost nothing, not her house, not her furniture, not even the clothes on her own back. Once she said her vows, there was one particular trade in London where women bought, sold, negotiated, and kept their own earnings entirely under their own name. And this was not some small forgettable corner trade tucked away down a back alley. It dressed queens. They were called silk women, and if that title sounds delicate to you, do not let it fool you for a second. Silk women took raw silk thread shipped in at great expense from Italy and turned it into what the trade called narrow wear ribbons, laces, cords, tassels and buttons all woven entirely by hand. Look closely at an old portrait of a Tudor gentleman someday at the fine cord lacing his doublet, or the tassel hanging from a bound prayer book on a lady's writing desk, and there is a fair chance a silkwoman's fingers made it. It was fine finishing work, the kind of detail that turned a plain gown into something a noble family was proud to be seen wearing in public. Slow, precise, physically demanding on the eyes and the hands alike. The sort of craft you could not fake and could not rush, and for well over 100 years this particular corner of the economy belonged almost entirely to women. It was also considered, oddly enough, a respectable trade for a young woman of good family to learn not just to trade for the desperate or the poor. An old royal statute had actually encouraged it, describing the craft as suitable work for young gentlewomen, taking on apprentices of their own. So picture for a moment a merchant's daughter of maybe 12 or 13, sent not to learn embroidery for her own future household alone, but formally apprenticed to a working silkwoman, learning a trade the same way a boy might be apprenticed to a goldsmith. It is a small detail, but it quietly undoes the idea that a Tudor girl's only real education was learning how to be pleasant company for a future husband. Picture the actual work for a moment, because it is easy to say the word silk and imagine something soft and effortless, when the reality was closer to sitting hunched over a small frame for hours at a stretch. Fingers cramping, eyes straining in whatever light the window offered that day, twisting raw thread into cord tight enough to survive years of wear on a nobleman's sleeve. It was called throwing this first stage of turning raw silk into usable thread, and a woman skilled at it was known in the trade as a throster. There was nothing decorative about the labour itself, even if the finished product looked like it belonged in a painting. Interestingly enough, most silkwomen were married to mercers, the very merchants who imported the raw silk from overseas in the first place, which meant a husband might sail the material in through the port of London, and his wife would turn it into the finished goods that actually sold for a profit. It was in the best cases something close to a genuine partnership, two different skill sets under one roof, each one useless in isolation and valuable together. Though I should be honest with you here, because not every marriage worked that way in practice. Some husbands treated their wife's trade as simply an extension of their own, taking credit, taking control, treating femme sole status as a technicality rather than real independence. The law offered women a door. It never guaranteed every husband would actually let them walk through it. One silkwoman in particular left behind enough paperwork, Will's Guild records, royal accounts, that historians can still trace her career hundreds of years later. Her name was Alice Claver, and by the time the Tudor family was taking its very first uncertain steps onto the English throne, she was already one of the wealthiest tradeswomen in the whole city. She had married a mercer named Richard Claver, a respectable man with a respectable business, and on paper that marriage should have quietly ended her financial story right there. Under the law of the time, everything a wife owned technically became her husband's, the moment she said her vows. And yet when Richard died, his own will made a point of leaving Alice something specific described in the old records simply as her own goods, a small phrase that quietly confirms something rather large. Alice had clearly been trading independently long before anyone bothered writing it down for her. This is where a strange little loophole in London law slips into the story, something historians now call femme sole status. Across most of the country, a married woman had no separate legal existence from her husband at all. But London, always a little more interested in commerce than in convention, allowed certain wives to register and trade as though they were single. If she ran up debt, she alone answered for it in court. If she made a fortune, that fortune was legally hers to keep signed for and pass along however she pleased. Her husband could not be dragged into her business affairs, and just as importantly, her trade could not be dragged down if he ran into financial trouble of his own. I find this little detail almost funny in a very tired, very familiar way. The system did not bend because anyone in charge suddenly decided women deserved financial independence. It bent because keeping a wife's trade separate from her husband's debts was tidy practical good for business, and only happened to hand a woman something close to real freedom as a convenient side effect. Convenience, if you look closely enough, has quietly done more for equality throughout history than most people ever give it credit for. But let's not pretend this particular door only ever swung open in a woman's favour, because that would be misleading you, and misleading you is not why we are here tonight. Femme sole status cut both ways. If a silk woman's business failed, if a customer defaulted, if a shipment of thread was lost at sea, she alone faced the court, she alone faced the debt, and she alone could be sent to prison for it all, while her husband stood legally untouched by any of it. Independence in this particular corner of London law came bundled tightly together with total personal risk. Nobody was quietly rescuing these women if the numbers went wrong. There was no family safety net waiting underneath the tightrope, only the tightrope itself and whatever skill she had built to keep her balance on it. Alice was not the only one juggling a full trade and a full household at once either. A contemporary of hers, a silk woman named Beatrice Filer, ran her own business as a femme sole while raising 8 children with her Mercer husband Thomas. 8. Let that sit for a moment next to whatever your own to-do list looked like this week. There was no nursery down the hall, no scheduled help arriving at 9, simply a woman running a household full of children with one hand and a fully independent silk trade with the other, and doing both well enough that her name still survives in guild records half a millennium later, if you grew up like a lot of people did with the general impression that women of this period simply stayed home, raised children, and had no real relationship with money at all. Stories like Alice and Beatrice's are exactly why that impression needs a little updating. It is not that the impression is entirely wrong. Most women, especially outside London, truly did have limited legal and financial standing. But history rarely divides neatly into all or nothing, and London's silk trade sits right in that uncomfortable, fascinating middle ground. Real independence, real wealth, real legal standing existing quietly inside a system that on paper insisted none of it should be possible at all. And these women were not simply grateful for whatever scraps of independence the law happened to allow them either. In the year 1455, a group of London silk women did something almost nobody expects to hear about women with no legal vote and no seat anywhere near government. They petitioned Parliament directly asking for protection from cheap silk goods flooding in from overseas and undercutting their prices, and astonishingly Parliament actually listened. Over the following 30 years, lawmakers passed 5 separate acts protecting the London silk trade, specifically because of pressure applied by these women, the last of them stretching all the way to the very edge of the Tudor era. Long before anyone had coined the phrase trade lobbying, a small group of silk women in London had already quietly figured out how to do exactly that. Here is where the story becomes almost impossible to overstate. This was not a trade that flickered briefly and vanished. Silk women dressed the royal household across the entire span of the Tudor dynasty. Records show them supplying ribbons and trim for Elizabeth of York in the final years of the 15th century. A silk woman named Joan Wilkinson supplied silk for Anne Boleyn's gowns, and after Anne's arrest, it was this same woman who quietly received books Anne had once purchased passed along through her own chaplain, a small sad detail that has always stayed with me longer than it probably should. Another silk woman recorded simply as Mistress Vaughan supplied silk to 3 different queens in a row, Anne Boleyn, Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr, surviving the most dangerous, unpredictable court in English history, one careful commission at a time. Decades later, a silkwoman named Marie Wilkinson supplied Spanish lace and clothing for Mary I's own coronation, and the Privy Council paid her the equivalent of £200 for her work that year alone, an almost unthinkable sum at a time when an ordinary labourer might earn only a few pounds across an entire 12 months of hard work. And when Elizabeth I finally took the throne, women named Alice Smythe and Alice Montague were still there, still dressing the crown, still being paid handsomely for it. An unbroken thread of tradeswomen running quietly underneath 4 completely different reigns, 4 completely different queens, and one endlessly turbulent century. Now, if all of that makes you picture some kind of official medal-worthy institution, a proud company of silk women with its own grand hall and its own seal, I have to disappoint you slightly. And this is where the story turns a little more bittersweet. Despite the wealth, despite the royal clients, despite successfully lobbying Parliament itself, the silk women of London never once formed their own guild. Historians have spent years picking apart exactly why, and the honest answer is probably a mixture of smaller reasons rather than one single cause. There were deep assumptions that a woman's place ultimately belonged in her household, rather than in a formal institution. There was quiet fear among the women themselves of being folded into male-run guilds and losing whatever independence they already had. And there was a simple, unspoken expectation that a woman's trade belonged to her family as a whole, rather than to her personally as a career she could call entirely her own. Without a guild to formally protect and pass down their skills, the way male trades did something slow and quietly sad happened as the 16th century wore on. Men began moving into the silk business, in growing numbers, eventually forming their own official guild to protect their own interests. The exact kind of institution the silk women themselves had never once been permitted to build. Piece by piece, an industry that women had created defended in Parliament, and supplied to 4 generations of queens slipped out of their hands and into a guild hall with their names nowhere on the door. If you want my honest opinion, sitting here telling you this story tonight, that particular turn is one of the more frustrating patterns you will find anywhere in this entire era. Women were trusted enough to dress a queen for her own coronation, skilled enough to be written into royal account books by name, organised enough to change actual law in their own favour, and still somehow never considered legitimate enough to be handed the one piece of paper that might have protected all of it for good. Competence was rarely the obstacle in this period. Permission almost always was. Makes you wonder, doesn't it, how many other quiet, capable hands built pieces of history that someone else eventually claimed the credit for. It also makes me wonder about something a little closer to home, and maybe you have wondered it too. How many small businesses do we walk past today without a second thought? Tailoring shops, family bakeries, tiny stores run out of somebody's kitchen table, built almost entirely on one person's skill and stubbornness, that history will simply never bother writing down for reasons that have nothing to do with how good the work actually was. There is one more thing worth remembering about Alice and about Beatrice, and about every silk woman whose name we still happen to know. We only know these particular names because they were wealthy enough or well connected enough for someone official to bother recording them somewhere. Beneath them sat an entire quiet layer of ordinary silk women apprentices, assistants, widows working alone in smaller rooms with smaller order books, whose names were never written down at all, and whose skill kept this whole glittering trade running just as much as any court favourite did. I think about that layer more than the famous names, if I'm being completely honest with you. The Queen's account books remember Marie Wilkinson and Joan Wilkinson and Mistress Vaughan because money changed hands at a level someone felt was worth documenting. But somewhere in a room above a shop not unlike the one our girl left this morning, there were dozens of other women coiling silk thread by candlelight, teaching the trade to a daughter or a niece, quietly keeping a household fed on wages nobody thought important enough to write into a ledger. History remembers the transaction. It rarely remembers the hands. And maybe that is worth carrying with you as we keep walking through this city together tonight long after the silk stalls fade behind us. Skill has never needed permission to exist. It only ever needed someone willing to notice it, and history, frustratingly, has always been a little selective about who it chooses to notice. Somewhere across the city at almost exactly this same hour, another woman is walking a very different kind of morning one with far less silk and considerably more risk. We caught a glimpse of her earlier leaving the market with a leather bag slung across her body, moving with the kind of urgency nobody around her thought to question. I think it is time we finally found out where she was headed, and why an entire family had just placed more trust and more quiet power in her two hands than in almost anyone else they would ever meet in their lives. She turns down a narrow alley our girl would recognize from 100 ordinary mornings, except this particular morning is not ordinary at all for the household waiting behind the door at the end of it. A servant is already standing in the doorway, wringing her hands the way people do when there is nothing useful left for them to do with them. Somewhere above, muffled through old plaster and thick wooden beams, comes the unmistakable sound of a woman in the hardest labour of her life. The woman with the leather bag does not knock. She simply walks in the way you walk into a room you have entered 100 times before, already rolling up her sleeves before she's even reached the stairs. She's a midwife, and in a moment I am going to tell you something about her job that stopped me completely. The first time I came across it, buried in an old church record nobody thought to make particularly dramatic. But first picture the room she's walking into, because it looked nothing like a hospital ward, and nothing like anywhere you or I have ever given birth or watched someone else do it. No machines monitoring a heartbeat. No clean, sterile lighting. Just a low-curtained bed, a birthing stool with a wide-open seat carved specifically to let a woman labour upright with gravity, working in her favour, instead of against her a fire kept burning regardless of the season, and a small circle of women, a sister, a mother, a trusted neighbour gathered close because childbirth in this period belonged almost entirely to women. Men, including husbands, including physicians, were simply not present in that room unless something had already gone seriously wrong, and when a physician finally was called, it rarely meant progress. Trained physicians in this period studied theory out of old Latin textbooks, learned about the body mostly through lecture rather than practice, and were quite frankly far less experienced with the physical reality of labour than the midwife already standing at the bedside. A physician's arrival at a birth usually signalled danger rather than expertise, a last resort brought in when things had already gone wrong enough that someone felt they needed a university degree in the room, whether or not that degree translated into anything actually useful once he got there. The real expertise built through years of hands-on repetition, rather than any classroom, belonged to the woman with no formal license at all. Learning her trade the way most skilled women of this period learned everything through apprenticeship observation and a kind of accumulated instinct no textbook could teach. Most midwives came to the profession the same quiet way most trades passed down through Tudor households, learning at the elbow of a mother, an aunt, or an older midwife willing to take on an apprentice, absorbing the work through years of simply being present at births long before ever taking one on alone. Reputation mattered enormously. A midwife who delivered a wealthy woman's child safely might find herself recommended household to household town To town her name passed along in exactly the kind of word-of-mouth network we still rely on today whenever we ask a friend who they trust with something that actually matters. Fail too often, though, and that same word-of-mouth network could quietly close every door in town, no explanation required. And something going wrong was never a distant possibility back then. It was closer every single time than most of us can comfortably imagine tonight. Best estimates from historians studying this period suggest somewhere between 70 and 90 out of every 100 women survived childbirth without serious complication, which sounds reasonably comforting until you remember what that means for the other side of the number. Survival for the newborn was, if anything, even more uncertain. More than 1 in 4 infants in this period did not live to see their first birthday, a number so far removed from what most of us expect for our own children today that it barely feels real reading it back. There was an old saying that circulated through English villages for generations, something along the lines of men dying in battle while women died bringing new life into the world, and it was not poetry. It was closer to a plain statement of fact that everyone quietly understood, and almost nobody said out loud in polite company. Imagine walking into work tomorrow, knowing those were actually the odds waiting for you. It changes how you might look at every single woman calmly going about her morning in this city, doesn't it? Which brings us to the detail that stopped me cold when I first read it. The midwife standing in that room held a kind of religious authority the church handed to absolutely no other woman in the entire country in any other circumstance for any other reason. If a newborn baby appeared to be dying too weak, too early, too fragile to survive even the short walk to a church font, the midwife herself was permitted to perform an emergency baptism right there in the birthing room with her own hands and her own words. No priest required, no permission needed in the moment. Church doctrine at the time held that an unbaptized infant could not enter heaven, so rather than risk a soul slipping away unclaimed, the church made exactly one exception to centuries of male-only sacrament, and it handed that exception to midwives. Sit with that for a second, because it is worth sitting with. In a world that would not let a woman preach from a pulpit vote on a single law, or stand as a witness in most courts, without a man's word carrying more weight than hers, the church still trusted her, specifically her with the decision about the eternal fate of a human soul. Nobody double-checked her judgment in that moment. Nobody stood over her shoulder demanding she wait for a man to arrive first. It is, as far as historians can tell, the only formally recognized instance of the medieval and early modern church allowing a woman to carry out anything resembling a sacrament, and it happened quietly in ordinary bedrooms all across the country, probably thousands of times over without a single monument ever built to mark it. Of course, trust of that size came with weight attached to it, and the church made sure every midwife understood exactly how much. Before she was permitted to practice, a midwife typically swore an oath before her local bishop, promising among other things never to substitute one infant for another, never to conceal the truth of a birth, and never to allow a labouring woman to falsely claim a child's father was someone other than the man responsible. Some versions of the oath even required her to hand over the afterbirth and umbilical cord, rather than let them disappear, because both were feared to be useful in exactly the kind of folk magic the church was determined to stamp out. She swore, too, to serve rich and poor alike without favouritism, to keep whatever secret she witnessed inside that room, and to call for a priest the moment a birth turned dangerous enough to require one, regardless of the hour or the weather or how far she had to send someone running through dark streets to fetch him. A midwife, in other words, was not simply delivering a baby. She was standing as a sworn witness to the truth of an entire family's future, at the single moment in that family's life when the truth mattered more than almost anything else. And nowhere did that witness role matter more than inside the royal household itself. Buried in the old expense ledgers of the crown, there is a payment recorded to a London midwife, who attended the final childbirth of Elizabeth of York, wife to the very first Tudor king, a birth that ended in the loss of the child shortly afterward. We do not know this woman's name. History simply never bothered to record it, even though the crown clearly trusted her enough to bring her back for what may have been several royal births in a row. It is a small, strange kind of injustice if you think about it. A silk woman lucky enough to supply ribbon for a royal gown might have her name preserved in an account book for centuries. A midwife trusted with the actual survival of royal blood is remembered only as an anonymous line item paid and then forgotten. Tell me honestly, does that trade-off strike you as fair? Because it has never once struck me that way. Royal births came wrapped in their own particular rituals too, layered thick with a kind of anxious devotion you rarely see attached to anything today. In the weeks before her expected delivery, a noble woman would withdraw from public life entirely into what was called her confinement, sealed away in a heavily curtained, warmly heated chamber, sometimes for a month or more surrounded only by women. Physical relics believed to ease labour were brought in and kept close at hand, sashes and belts, said to have touched holy garments centuries earlier, passed from household to household, like borrowed luck. It sounds almost superstitious to modern ears, and it was, but underneath the superstition sat something achingly human. Families reaching for anything, absolutely anything, that might tip the odds even slightly in their favour during the most dangerous hours a woman in this period would ever face. Then the Reformation arrived, and it did not spare the birthing room either. As England broke away from the old church and reshaped its religious practices from the ground up, church leaders began actively discouraging and in some places outright banning exactly these kinds of relics and rituals. One bishop in the south of England issued instructions in the late 1530s specifically forbidding midwives in his diocese from using sashes, purses, or so-called measures of holy garments during labour, dismissing them as superstition, unworthy of a properly reformed faith. Picture it for a moment and try not to smile, because I certainly did the first time I pictured it myself. A woman screaming through the hardest hour of her life, reaching instinctively for the one comfort her mother and grandmother had always reached for too, only to be told mid-labour by a distant church official who had never once experienced childbirth himself that her comfort was now against the rules. Some traditions simply do not care what the paperwork says, and I suspect more than a few midwives quietly kept a relic tucked in a pocket, regardless of what any bishop had decreed. There is a darker thread running underneath all of this trust too, one I would be doing you a disservice to leave out. The very knowledge that made a midwife valuable, her understanding of herbs of the body, of exactly which remedy eased, which pain sat dangerously close to the kind of knowledge that got other women accused of witchcraft during this same stretch of history. A midwife who lost a difficult birth, however unavoidable the loss truly was, could suddenly find her years of trusted service reinterpreted overnight as something far more sinister. The same skilled hands that once baptized a dying infant with the church's blessing could, in a different town on a different day in front of a different set of suspicious neighbours, be accused of causing the very tragedy they had fought desperately to prevent. It is a strange, almost cruel irony worth pausing on. The one profession granting a woman genuine religious authority was at the exact same time one of the professions most exposed to religious suspicion. Trust and suspicion, it turns out, were never as far apart in this period as we might like to believe, and the very same skill that made her indispensable on a good day made her an easy target on a bad one. And because midwives were present at literally every birth that mattered politically, they occasionally found themselves standing at the exact centre of the kingdom's biggest secrets. One of history's more persistent theories involves Queen Mary I, who in the middle of her reign announced with total confidence that she was pregnant, prepared a nursery, and waited through months of a pregnancy that never actually produced a child. According to accounts that have survived from the period, it was her own midwife, alongside a childhood nurse who quietly began voicing doubts, long before the wider court dared to noticing things about her body that simply did not match what a genuine pregnancy at that stage should look like. They had attended enough real pregnancies to notice what was missing from this one, and their doubts apparently reached the Queen's own ladies long before anyone worked up the courage to say the words out loud to Mary herself. Historians still debate exactly what was happening to the Queen's body during that strange, painful chapter of her life, whether illness, grief, or something else entirely. But the detail that always stays with me is simply this. Even a queen surrounded by physicians, chaplains, and advisors could not hide the truth from the one woman in the room who actually knew what a real pregnancy looked like up close. I find something quietly remarkable in all of this, and I want to leave you with it before we move on tonight. Of every job we have looked at so far, the midwife may be the one holding the strangest, most contradictory kind of power. Trusted with the soul's entry into heaven, yet rarely trusted with her own name in the history books. Trusted enough to stand nearer to a queen's body than her own doctors, yet vulnerable enough to be branded a witch on nothing more than a neighbour's grief and suspicion. It makes you wonder how many other women throughout history held exactly that kind of impossible contradictory trust, essential right up until the moment they became convenient to blame. And maybe that contradiction is the real thread worth pulling on tonight more than any single fact about baptism or bishops or royal pregnancies. Every job we have walked through so far in this city has carried some version of the same quiet bargain. Extraordinary responsibility handed to a woman precisely because no one else was willing or able to do it, with almost none of the lasting credit that responsibility should have earned her. The silk woman dressed a queen, and still could not put her name over a shop door. The midwife decided the fate of a newborn soul, and still could not stand as a full witness in most ordinary courtrooms. I keep asking myself, sitting here telling you all this, whether that pattern ever really disappeared, or whether it simply changed its costume and kept walking quietly through every century since. Back down in the street, the mornings kept moving without either of us. Somewhere near the market, we left behind a woman is just finishing settling a fresh barrel of ale into place, wiping her hands on her apron, completely unaware that her own strange, surprisingly political corner of this city's economy is exactly where we're headed next. The barrel settles into place with a heavy, satisfying thud against the cobblestones, and the woman straightens up, wiping both hands down the front of her apron, before reaching for the wooden mallet hanging from her belt. She taps the bung loose, gives the whole thing one final inspection, the way a mechanic might walk around a car before handing over the keys, and calls out to nobody in particular that the morning batch is ready. A thin curl of steam still rises off the surface, where she left it cooling overnight, and the smell warm, faintly sweet a little like toasted bread left too long near a fire, drifts down the street ahead of her before a single customer has even arrived. Nobody in this street would think twice about what she's doing. That is precisely what makes her story worth stopping for. Because brewing was without much competition the single most common trade a woman in this city could hold. Not the most glamorous, not the most talked about at court, but the most common by an enormous margin stretching across every single social class from the poorest cottage in the countryside to the kitchens of noble households. If a woman in this period worked outside her own home for money at all, there was a strong chance that work involved a brewing kettle at some point in her life. Historians combing through old court and tax records have found entire towns where women outnumbered men in the trade by staggering margins, one Welsh town recording something close to 30 female brewers against a single man doing the same work. Think about that ratio for a moment, because numbers like that rarely happen by accident. It was not that men were somehow incapable of brewing ale. It was that brewing sat conveniently close to skills a woman was already expected to have. Anyway, boiling grain, managing a fire, timing a process by feel rather than by clock, the same domestic competence society demanded of her, regardless of whether she ever sold a single drop. Turning an everyday household task into a small, steady stream of income required almost no extra equipment and almost no permission from anyone. A woman could brew a slightly larger batch than her family needed, sell the surplus out her own front window, and nobody would blink. It was in a very real sense the most accessible form of self-employment available to an ordinary woman anywhere in the country. And here is a detail that tends to surprise people who assume medieval and Tudor life ran on rigid, orderly rules. Ale-making was regulated closely and constantly by local officials whose entire job was tasting it. These officials, usually men appointed by the town, would go door to door sampling each new batch, checking it against a fixed price and a fixed standard of quality, and fining anyone who fell short. The system had a name, the assize of ale, and in practice it meant a woman could not simply brew and sell in peace. She was inspected repeatedly by a man whose authority existed almost entirely to catch her doing something wrong. If her batch was declared weak, or her measure came up short, or her price crept even slightly above what the town allowed, the fine landed on her directly, regardless of whether her husband's name happened to appear anywhere on the household's official paperwork. In a strange, almost backhanded way, historians studying these court rolls have noticed that the fines functioned less like genuine punishment and more like an informal license fee, a small, semi-regular cost of doing business that most brewsters simply paid and carried on. A woman fined 3 separate times across a single year for selling under the correct measure was not necessarily a dishonest tradeswoman being repeatedly caught. She may well have simply been a busy one, brewing often enough that the odds of an inspector catching an off-batch rose right along with her output, success and suspicion once again sitting a little too close together for comfort, and that income mattered in ways easy to overlook from where we are sitting tonight. A few extra coins earned from a surplus batch of ale might buy shoes for a child, pay down a debt her husband never mentioned aloud, or simply give a woman a small private pocket of money that belonged to no one but her in a legal system that otherwise insisted almost nothing did. For plenty of Tudor households, the difference between a lean winter and a survivable one came down to exactly this kind of quiet, unglamorous, endlessly underestimated female labour, boiled up in a kettle and sold 1 cup at a time. There is one more layer of quiet irony buried inside the record books that I think deserves a mention here, because it undercuts a common assumption people carry into this story. Where brewing did organise itself into guilds, women were sometimes technically admitted as members, but almost always through their husband's name rather than their own, listed formally as his wife, rather than as a brewster in her own right. And yet historians examining the actual day-to-day operation of these households have found the opposite arrangement playing out behind closed doors. The husband's name sat on the guild roll for appearance's sake, while the wife handled the mash tun, judged the fire, tasted each batch for readiness, and effectively ran the entire operation herself. The paperwork told one story, the kitchen told a completely different one. Now you might expect that kind of scrutiny to fall equally on anyone selling drink, and on paper it did. Court records from Oxford in the early 1300s show men and women being fined for the exact same offences in roughly equal numbers, watered-down batches, overcharging short measures. Equal crime, equal punishment, at least according to the ledger. But walk out of the courtroom and into the popular imagination of the period, and the picture becomes dramatically less balanced. It was overwhelmingly the woman behind the counter who became the villain of the story, not the man. Step into almost any old parish church from this period, and you might find her painted directly onto the wall, usually somewhere near a scene of the damned being marched off to hell. Alewives show up again and again in what were called doom paintings, the large dramatic murals medieval and early Tudor churches used to remind an illiterate congregation exactly what awaited sinners condemned alongside liars and thieves for the specific sin of cheating customers with a short paw. One surviving carving tucked into a church in the town of Ludlow shows an alewife being dragged bodily into the mouth of hell itself. Her brewing tools carved right alongside her, so nobody in the pews could mistake who she was or what she had supposedly done to deserve it. One surviving play from Chester goes even further, showing Christ himself redeeming almost every sinner in the story, except her, the alewife left behind in the fire, while everyone else is forgiven. Sit with that for a second. An entire town could sit in a wooden pew on a Sunday and watch a performance where murderers found mercy and a woman selling slightly weak beer did not. Why her specifically, and not the men committing the exact same offences sitting right beside her in the record books? I have spent a fair amount of time turning that question over, and the most honest answer historians have landed on is not particularly flattering to anyone involved. An alehouse run by a woman was an unusually public, unusually independent kind of space for a woman to control. In this period, a place where men gathered, drank, gossiped, and occasionally lost more money than they should have, all under her roof and by her rules. It made people nervous in a way male-run trades simply did not, turning her into a figure of suspicion, greed, even moral danger, was whether anyone admitted it openly, or not a convenient way of keeping that particular kind of female authority a little smaller and a little less comfortable. One town took that discomfort about as far as it could legally go. In the year 1540, officials in Chester passed an ordinance banning women between the ages of 14 and 40 from selling ale, at all restricting the trade to women considered either too young or too old to be viewed as sexually available. Read that back slowly because it deserves a second read. A city government looked at its own brewing industry, decided the real problem was not the quality of the drink, but the age and perceived desirability of the woman pouring it, and wrote that judgment directly into law. It is one of those details from this period that stops feeling like distant history and starts feeling uncomfortably familiar the moment you say it out loud. Despite all of it, some brewsters managed to build genuine reputations worth defending. A woman named Eleanor Rummage became well known enough in her own lifetime that a court poet wrote an entire satirical piece about her, mocking her appearance in fairly merciless detail, while almost as an aside admitting her ale itself was excellent, exactly the kind of strong, well-made brew people travelled out of their way to drink. It is a strange kind of fame being remembered for centuries, mostly through the words of a man who clearly found more material in criticising her face than in praising her craft. And yet the craft is the only reason anyone still bothers writing about her at all. Even her harshest critic could not quite bring himself to deny that she was simply good at her job. Funny how that particular double standard mock the woman quietly rely on her skill anyway has never fully gone out of style. There is one more thread tangled into this story that I want to hand you honestly, without pretending it is more settled than it actually is. A number of the visual details we now associate with the classic image of a witch, a tall pointed hat worn to stand out at busy markets, a broom propped outside the door as a simple trade sign, a black cat kept mostly to guard the grain stores from mice, were also everyday practical tools of the alewife's trade. Some historians have pointed out the striking overlap between these two figures, and wondered aloud whether centuries of suspicion toward brewing women quietly bled into the witch panics that followed. Other historians push back hard on that theory, arguing the evidence is far too thin to draw a straight line between the two. I will not pretend to settle a debate that trained historians still have not settled themselves, but I find the mere existence of the argument worth mentioning to you tonight, because it tells you something regardless of which side turns out to be right. Whether or not the connection is real, the fact that so many people find it believable says quite a lot about how deeply this profession had already been tangled up with suspicion long before anyone accused a single woman of witchcraft. By the later stretch of the Tudor century, something else was quietly reshaping the entire trade, something with far less folklore attached to it, and far more cold practical consequence. Brewers along the southeast coast began adding a new ingredient to their kettles, a bittering plant called hops, imported originally from the Low Countries across the water. Drink made this new way earned its own name beer to separate it from traditional unhopped ale, and beer turned out to have one enormous advantage over everything women like our alewife had been brewing for centuries. It kept. It travelled. A batch of hopped beer could survive weeks at sea or months in a cellar without turning sour, which meant it could be sold far beyond the street where it was made shipped, stored, scaled up into something resembling genuine industry, rather than a household side trade. And scaling up cost money, real money, the kind needed to buy hop yards, build proper kilns and finance shipments that would not turn a profit for months. It was exactly the kind of capital most women of this period married, or not simply did not have independent access to. A married woman's assets, as we have already seen more than once tonight, legally belonged to her husband the moment she said her vows, which meant borrowing against property, securing a loan, or investing in new equipment, almost always required a man's signature standing behind hers, if it was allowed to happen at all. Guilds, on the other hand, did have that kind of capital, pulled from dozens of members backed by reputation and legal standing. The individual alewife could never hope to match on her own. As brewing shifted from something practiced beside the kitchen fire into something practiced inside dedicated commercial breweries, those guilds moved in, formalized the trade, and largely closed their membership to women in the process. By the time the Tudor dynasty gave way to the century that followed, most brewers in London were men running businesses several times the size of anything an individual alewife had ever managed on her own kitchen fire. I keep noticing this same pattern each time we look closely at one of these trades tonight, and I do not think it is a coincidence anymore. A woman builds a skill out of necessity. She becomes truly excellent at it, sometimes excellent enough to outnumber every man in her own town doing the same work. And then, right at the exact moment that skill becomes profitable enough to formalize, protect, and scale the doors that get built around it, somehow always seem to swing shut just before she reaches them. We saw it with the silk trade dressed in ribbon and royal patronage. We're seeing it again here dressed in barrels and hop yards instead. Different fabric, same shape. Ask yourself honestly if you had told our alewife tonight that in a few short generations men would dominate the very trade she had spent her whole life mastering. Would she have been surprised, or would some tired familiar part of her already have expected exactly that? And maybe ask yourself something a little closer to home while you're at it. How many times in your own life, or in the life of someone you love, has a skill built out of pure necessity, learned the hard way, practiced quietly for years, only started earning real recognition once someone with more capital and fewer obstacles decided it was worth taking seriously. Somewhere behind her, past the ale barrels and the smell of yeast still hanging thick in the morning air, a carriage rattles down toward the wider road leading out of the city, its curtains drawn just enough to hint at the fine cloth inside without quite revealing who is riding in it. Whoever she is headed somewhere our girl has never once been allowed to set foot, and by the time that carriage reaches its destination, you're going to understand exactly why getting a seat inside it was worth almost anything a woman of this period could offer. The carriage slows at a gatehouse tall enough to swallow our girl's entire street twice, over wheels crunching onto raked gravel instead of cobblestones for the first time all morning. A guard glances at the crest painted on the door, nods, and waves it through without a single question asked. Whoever sits behind those curtains does not need to explain herself here. That alone tells you almost everything about the world she is entering. Beyond the gate, the noise of the city falls away almost entirely, replaced by something quieter and in its own way far more calculated. Clipped hedges, servants moving with their eyes down and their pace deliberately unhurried, because rushing in front of the wrong person could be read as panic, and panic was not a look anyone here could afford. Somewhere past the outer courtyard, a set of doors opens onto a chamber, warmed by more fires than our girl's entire street shares, between every household combined, and inside it, a queen sits surrounded by a small, carefully arranged circle of young women, all of them watching her, all of them waiting for the smallest cue about what she might need next. Let me hand you a fact before we go any further, because it is the kind of detail that tends to rearrange how you think about the rest of this story. 3 of the 6 women Henry VIII eventually married began their lives at court, not as queens at all, but as ladies-in-waiting serving the queen who came directly before them. Anne Boleyn served Catherine of Aragon, Jane Seymour served Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard served Anne of Cleves. Read that pattern back slowly because it is not a coincidence, and it is not romantic in the way old paintings like to suggest. It is something closer to a job description nobody wrote down on paper. Stand close enough to the throne for long enough, and you become a candidate for it too, whether or not that was ever the plan. So let's talk about what a lady-in-waiting actually was, because the phrase itself has softened over the centuries into something that sounds decorative, almost passive, a woman simply waiting around in a nice dress. The reality was considerably sharper than that. These were young women, almost always from noble or well-connected families, placed into a queen's household to serve her directly, and the competition for even a modest position among her ladies was fierce enough to consume entire family fortunes and family reputations chasing it. A girl did not apply for a place at court the way you might apply for a job today. There was no posting, no interview in the sense we would recognize. Instead, her family worked its connections relentlessly, calling in favours from anyone already established near the royal household, writing letters, arranging introductions, sometimes waiting years for a single opening to appear. Landing a place for your daughter in a queen's chamber was in the most practical sense one of the single greatest investments a noble family could make, because proximity to the crown had a way of quietly reshaping everything else about a family's fortune, from the marriages available to their other children to the favours they could call in from powerful men who had never once met them directly. And here is something worth pausing on, because it quietly separates this job from every other one we have looked at tonight. There was in the modern sense barely any wage attached to it at all. A lady-in-waiting was typically housed, fed and clothed at the Queen's expense, and might receive the occasional gift, a piece of jewellery, a length of fine cloth, a small sum on a special occasion. but she was not drawing a regular salary the way a silkwoman collected payment for finished ribbon, or an alewife counted coins across her counter. Her real compensation was almost entirely invisible on any ledger reputation connection, and the steadily improving odds of a marriage far above what her family could have arranged for her otherwise. It was, in other words, a job you took not for what it paid today, but for what it might quietly be worth 10 years later. Once she arrived, the actual work filled her days far more completely than the popular image suggests. Dressing the Queen each morning, an elaborate process involving layers of fabric, jewellery and hair arrangement that could take the better part of an hour before anyone outside the chamber ever saw the finished result, followed almost immediately by undressing her again. Come evening, folding and inspecting garments worth more than most households would see in a lifetime, managing correspondence and small errands, providing conversation, music and company through long stretches of a Queen's Day that might otherwise have been unbearably lonely, since a queen, for all her power, was frequently one of the most isolated people in the entire palace. And beneath all of it, a constant, unglamorous undertone of surveillance, because everything a lady-in-waiting witnessed, every mood, every visitor, every private moment of frustration or joy, was information, and information at this level of the court was worth more than gold. Here is where the personalities of the queens themselves shaped court life, in ways that quietly reveal something about each woman. Catherine of Aragon kept her ladies close to devotional reading, insisting on quiet piety as the backbone of her household, a reflection of the deeply serious, almost unshakable religious conviction that would later carry her through years of humiliation without ever once publicly bending. Anne Boleyn, by contrast, handed her ladies small books of prayer and had them stitch garments for the poor with their own hands, a household culture built around visible charity as much as visible faith. The kind of calculated public image a woman clawing her way toward a crown could not afford to neglect. Jane Seymour ran her chamber with something closer to strict military precision, laying out exact rules for how long a lady's gown train should be, and even specifying the number of pearls expected on certain garments. An obsession with order that feels almost like overcorrection after the chaos of the Queen she replaced. 3 completely different queens, 3 completely different courts, operating under the very same roof across barely a decade, and in every single one of them, a lady-in-waiting's daily life bent itself around whatever version of order her mistress demanded that particular season. Imagine changing your entire daily rhythm, your wardrobe rules, even your hobbies, every time a new manager walked through the door, except the stakes of getting it wrong were measured in reputation rather than simply a bad performance review. Now, if you assume all of this danger and glamour applied equally to every lady in the room, let me introduce you to a woman whose career inside these walls stretched across an almost unbelievable span of political turmoil. Her name was Jane Boleyn, known to history mostly by her married title Lady Rochford, and she served not one queen, not 2, but 4 of them in succession. She began in Anne Boleyn's household, moved into Jane Seymour's, after Anne's fall continued on with Anne of Cleves, and finally landed in the innermost circle of Catherine Howard, her own younger cousin. 4 queens, 4 completely different courts, 4 entirely different sets of dangers to navigate, and she managed to remain close to the centre of power through every single transition, at a court where entire noble families rose and collapsed within the span of a single season. Think about what that actually required of her, day after day, year after year. Every time a queen fell from favour, the ladies who had surrounded her most closely fell under suspicion right along with her, guilty by association, whether or not they had done anything wrong at all. Jane Boleyn watched this happen to other women repeatedly, and somehow kept finding her own footing on the other side of it, securing a place in the household of whichever new queen arrived next again and again, as though she had privately mastered some skill the rest of the court never quite managed to name. Survival of that kind was not luck. It required an almost professional instinct for reading which way political winds were shifting weeks or even months before anyone official announced anything. It required knowing precisely when loyalty to a falling mistress had become a liability rather than a virtue, and when silence served you better than defence. Some historians examining the record around Anne Boleyn's downfall believe testimony from women inside her own household may have quietly fed the case being built against her, whether willingly or under considerable pressure from powerful men eager for exactly that kind of evidence. Proximity to the throne, it turns out, cut in both directions. The very same closeness that made a lady-in-waiting valuable also made her useful to anyone looking to bring the Queen down. And here is the part of Jane Boleyn's story that keeps me up thinking about it long after I first read it. The instincts that carried her safely through 3 changes of queen eventually failed her during the 4th. When her young cousin Catherine Howard was accused of infidelity, Jane Boleyn was implicated as well, accused of helping arrange secret meetings inside the Queen's own chambers. She was executed alongside Catherine Howard in the early months of the year 1542. A woman who had spent more than a decade successfully reading every shift in the wind at the most dangerous court in English history was ultimately undone by the one queen she happened to be related to by blood. If you want a single story that captures both the reward and the risk sitting inside this particular job, I do not think you will find a sharper one anywhere in this period. Ask yourself, honestly, would you have gambled a decade of careful survival on family loyalty too, or would you have finally, quietly stepped back? It is also worth knowing that not every woman in that chamber held equal standing, because the household itself was quietly stratified, almost like its own small company, with its own internal ranks. At the bottom sat the maids of honour, typically the youngest unmarried women closest in age and situation to our girl back on Cheapside, if she had ever been born into the right family. Above them stood the ladies of the Privy Chamber, married women of higher standing trusted with more intimate access to the Queen's daily life, and near the very top sat positions like Mistress of the Robes, a senior role overseeing the Queen's entire wardrobe, and the small army of women who maintained it, a job that came with genuine authority over other women rather than simply proximity to a powerful one. Climbing from the bottom rank to the top was its own quiet career, patient political, and every bit as calculated as anything happening in the rooms where men made the official decisions. A queen's full household could easily run to several dozen women once you counted every rank, from senior ladies down to the youngest maids barely out of the schoolroom, which meant a chamber like this one was never simply a quiet private space. It was a small crowded society of its own, thick with whispered alliances and equally whispered rivalries, where a careless comment repeated to the wrong person could unravel a friendship, a reputation, sometimes a family's entire standing at court all before supper. One story that survives from Anne Boleyn's household describes an unsettling drawing left in the Queen's own apartments. A crude, threatening image aimed squarely at her, which one of her ladies discovered and quietly brought to her attention, rather than letting it circulate further. Small moments like that one tell you something. The grand portraits never quite capture for every hour spent on embroidery and music. There were just as many spent managing threats, rumours, and each other in a chamber that looked peaceful from the outside and rarely felt that way from within. Let's pause on something worth being honest about here, because it is easy to romanticize all of this from a comfortable distance of 500 years. For every Anne Boleyn or Jane Seymour who rose from lady-in-waiting to queen, there were dozens upon dozens of other women who spent years, sometimes their entire adult lives, in exactly that same waiting position, and never rose an inch further. Most ladies-in-waiting did not marry a king. Most simply worked, served, watched, and eventually married, whichever respectable man their family and their years at court had positioned them to attract their own personal ambitions, folded quietly back into whatever advantage they had managed to secure for the family name behind them. The ladder existed technically, but only a vanishingly small number of women who stood on it ever reached the very top rung, and almost none of them could have predicted in advance which rung would turn out to be safe. The rest simply kept climbing anyway, because the alternative, staying home and hoping a good marriage found her without any help at all, offered even less certainty than this did, which makes me wonder something, and maybe you have wondered a version of this yourself. How many of us have taken a position, a school, a job, a relationship specifically, because of who we might meet there, what door it might quietly open, rather than for the position itself? There is nothing shameful in that instinct. These women were making entirely rational decisions inside a world that offered them very few other levers to pull. A career built on visible skill, the kind we saw in the silk trade or the brewing trade, was simply never open to a woman of noble birth in the first place. Proximity was the only currency her world actually allowed her to spend. But it does make you look twice at the glittering surface of court life, doesn't it? Once you realize how much genuine risk was quietly humming underneath every one of those careful smiles, and how thin the line really was between a life that ended in a crown and one that ended like Jane Boleyn's, on a scaffold in front of the very people she had once served, behind the palace kitchens, well beyond the sight of any lady-in-waiting adjusting a queen's sleeve. An entirely different kind of woman is already hours into her own working day, one that has nothing to do with courtly favour, and everything to do with keeping this enormous household actually fed. Every jug of milk on that breakfast table, every round of cheese served at a noble feast, passed through her hands long before it ever reached anyone important enough to notice her, and she has never once set foot inside a room like the one we just left. It is time we finally walked out past these gates and into the fields where her entire world quietly kept the rest of this glittering one alive. By the time the sun has fully climbed clear of the rooftops, we've left the palace grounds behind entirely, and the world around us has changed so completely it barely feels like the same morning. No cobblestones underfoot anymore, no raked gravel either. Just packed earth, low hedgerows, and the unmistakable, slightly sweet smell of a herd of cattle that has clearly been standing in roughly the same field for a very long time. Somewhere off past the tree line a dog barks twice and gives up, and the whole scene settles into the kind of quiet you only find well outside a city, thick and unhurried, broken only by bird song and the occasional low complaint of a cow waiting her turn. Somewhere near the middle of that field a woman is already crouched low on a three-legged stool forehead, pressed against the warm flank of a cowhands, moving in a steady practiced rhythm most of us have never once had to learn. She has likely been awake since well before our girl back in the city even opened her eyes up in the dark fingers stiff with cold, long before the first proper light touched the hedgerows. There is no romance in it up close, whatever soft focus paintings from a later centuries might try to tell you. It is repetitive, physically demanding work performed twice a day without fail in every kind of weather this island can produce. Here is something worth knowing straight away, because it quietly separates this job from almost every other one we've looked at tonight. Dairying, the milking, the butter, the cheese, all of it belonged to women so completely in this period that a man doing it would have looked distinctly out of place, almost as strange as finding him at a spinning wheel. This was not a trade women had to fight their way into around the edges of male competition, the way we saw with silk or ale. This was a trade men mostly stayed out of entirely by custom, rather than by any written law, leaving an entire branch of the agricultural economy almost completely in female hands. Historians who study this particular division of labour have offered a few different theories for why it settled this way, and I find all of them at least partly convincing rather than any single one being the whole answer. Dairying happened close to the farmhouse itself, unlike ploughing a distant field or driving cattle to market, which meant it could be woven in around the constant demands of children and household work in a way heavier. More distant labour simply could not. It also required patience and repetitive precision rather than raw upper body strength, the kind of skill built through years of careful practice rather than muscle alone, which the period's own biases happen to code as naturally feminine, whether or not that assumption held up under any real scrutiny. Whatever the original reasoning, by the time our girl is walking past this field, nobody working here would have thought to question who belonged behind that stool. It simply was the way things were done, so thoroughly that the custom hardly needed defending at all. A single dairymaid on a reasonably sized farm might be responsible for as many as 20 cows, sometimes more, with perhaps one other servant helping manage the sheer physical scale of it. Do the arithmetic on that for a moment. 20 cows milked twice daily by hand every single day, regardless of weather, regardless of how she was feeling, regardless of whether it was her birthday or a saint's day, or the coldest morning of an especially brutal winter. Each animal had her own temperament, her own quirks, a tendency to kick if approached from the wrong side or grow restless if milked by unfamiliar hands, which meant a good dairymaid was not simply performing a repetitive chore, but managing 20 individual relationships day after day, largely from memory. A bruised shin or a kicked-over pail was simply an occupational hazard nobody thought worth complaining about, the same way we might shrug off a paper cut at a desk job today. There was no such thing as a day off from a cow that needed milking. The animal did not care what else was happening in the world that day, and neither in the end could she, and milking was only the beginning of her morning, not the end of it. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, so within hours it needed to be skimmed, separated, and turned into something that would actually last butter for the household and the market cheese for storage through the long, lean months of winter when fresh food of any kind became scarce. Churning butter meant repetitive aching labour, the cream agitated over and over inside a wooden churn until it finally stubbornly separated into something solid, a process that could easily eat up the better part of an hour of steady, monotonous effort, with absolutely no shortcut available. Her arm ached the same way ours might ache after an hour at the gym, except she was not choosing this exertion for her health. She was choosing it because a household without butter was a household eating dry bread through the winter. Cheese-making asked even more of her, and it demanded a kind of practical chemistry no book ever taught her, learned entirely through field temperature and years of watching someone older do it first. Once the milk had thickened into a loose curd, she worked it by hand, gathering, pressing, breaking it apart and packing it back together, building it up layer by layer inside a mould, judging by touch alone whether the mixture was ready or needed another few minutes over the fire. In some dairying regions, the youngest, least experienced girls in the dairy were given the specific job of what old records charmingly call thrutching, throwing their entire body weight down onto the curds inside the press for up to 2 full hours at a stretch, squeezing out every last drop of whey before the cheese could properly set. I want you to actually picture that for a second. A teenage girl leaning her full weight onto a wooden press for 2 straight hours, arms shaking, because that was simply what the job required that day, and there was another cheese waiting behind this one the moment it finished. In some of the more established dairying counties, records from later in this same tradition show women owning and controlling roughly a third of all the cheese-making equipment in the entire region, tubs, presses and vats passed down mother to daughter, like tools of any respected trade, because in every meaningful sense, that is exactly what this was. Now here is where this particular trade quietly diverges from almost everything else we have discussed tonight, and it is worth pausing on. Butter money, as it was often called in later centuries, and something very close to it existed even now, functioned as a woman's own private income inside a marriage that legally recognized almost nothing as truly hers. A farmer's wife might sell her surplus butter and cheese directly at the local market, and by long, deeply entrenched custom, rather than by any formal law, the coins she brought home from that sale were understood to be hers to keep and spend as she saw fit. Buying small comforts, helping a struggling neighbour, or quietly saving towards something her husband never needed to know the full details of. Picture her walking home from market with a few coins tied into the corner of her apron, coins her husband would never think to ask about, coins that existed in a strange, informal pocket of the marriage neither the church nor the courts ever bothered to regulate. It was not femme sole status. There was no clever London loophole, involved no petition to Parliament behind it. It was simply tradition, old and stubborn enough that even a legal system built almost entirely around denying women financial independence somehow never got around to closing this particular door. Payment for the dairymaid's own labour, meanwhile, told a rather different story and a somewhat less generous one. Farm account books from across several centuries show dairymaids frequently paid partly, sometimes almost entirely in grain rather than coin, wheat, barley, whatever mixture the household could most easily spare its value, quietly absorbed into her keep rather than handed over as a wage she could spend however she pleased. Her skill fed the entire household in the most literal sense imaginable, and yet the household often repaid her in exactly the same currency she had already been living on. It is a strange kind of circle, isn't it, being paid in the very thing your own labour already produces? We talked earlier tonight about how badly the official records undercounted women's work across this entire period, and standing in this field watching exactly how much skill and repetition this job actually demanded, it is not hard to understand why. Grain paid in place of coin rarely gets itemized the same way a proper wage does, and a woman paid mostly in her own keep leaves behind a much thinner paper trail than the men working right alongside her. There is one more detail about this particular corner of Tudor life I want to leave with you, because it reaches forward through history in a way almost nothing else we've covered tonight does. People in dairying communities had long noticed informally, almost as a piece of folk wisdom passed between mothers and daughters, that milkmaids seemed to catch a particular unpleasant but rarely dangerous illness from the cows themselves. Small sores on the hands, a short fever, nothing worse, and that women who had already survived it never seemed to catch the much deadlier disease sweeping through towns and villages every few years, the one that scarred or killed almost everyone else it touched. Village gossip even turned it into a strange kind of compliment, the idea that a dairymaid's skin stayed remarkably clear and unmarked, precisely because of the very cows she spent her mornings pressed against. Nobody in this period understood why. It would take roughly 2 more centuries before a country doctor finally connected those dots properly and turned that quiet piece of dairy folklore into the world's first vaccine. But the truth those women had already noticed working through their 20 cows morning after morning, with no idea what they were actually protecting themselves from, was sitting right there in the milking shed the entire time, centuries before anyone with a medical degree thought to ask a dairymaid what she already knew. It is, I think, one of the more quietly remarkable facts in this entire story. An observation made by anonymous working women dismissed for generations as nothing more than rural superstition turned out to be one of the most important medical discoveries in human history, simply waiting for someone with the right credentials to finally take it seriously. Beyond the dairy itself, the wider fields tell yet another version of this same story. Come harvest season, women work those fields too, right alongside the men cutting, gathering, binding, hauling in numbers. Historians are only now beginning to properly count after centuries of those same women being quietly filed under someone else's name in the account books. But even here, doing recognizably identical physical labor under the same sun, the account books rarely treated her the same way her male counterpart was treated. Wage records surviving from this broader period show women earning noticeably less than men for stretches of harvest work that by every practical measure looked exactly the same from sunrise to sunset. Same crop, same field, same exhausting hours bent double under the same heat, same blistered hands by evening. Different number written down at the end of the week, and rarely any explanation offered for the gap beyond the simple, unspoken assumption that a woman's labour was worth a little less than a man's, regardless of what either of them had actually produced that day. It is worth sitting with how casually that assumption travelled generation after generation without anyone apparently needing to justify it out loud. Nobody stood in that field arguing that her sheaves were smaller or her hours shorter because they were not. The gap existed simply because it always had the kind of quiet, self-perpetuating unfairness that survives precisely because nobody in a position to change it ever has to look directly at it. I keep returning to a version of the same uncomfortable question tonight, and I do not think it is going away anytime soon. How much of what we now call unskilled labour throughout history was actually just skilled labour, performed by someone nobody in charge of the record books felt like properly valuing? Watching a girl press her whole body weight onto a cheese mould for 2 hours does not look like nothing to me. It looks like exactly the kind of quiet physical expertise entire households depended on completely and quietly, took for granted just as completely filed away in the same mental category as breathing or walking, simply something a woman did rather than something a woman had spent years learning to do well. And maybe ask yourself this too, since we have a little time left in this field together tonight. Somewhere in your own family, going back only a generation or two, there is very likely a woman whose labour kept an entire household fed, clothed, or running work that never once appeared on a payslip, never once earned a formal title, and never once stopped being absolutely essential. What would you call her job if you had to write it down properly for the very first time? And why do you suppose nobody ever asked you to before now? Past the far hedge where the pasture gives way to a narrow lane, sheep graze in loose, unhurried clusters, their wool thick and slightly matted after months of growing untouched. A few of them lift their heads as we pass entirely unbothered, chewing steadily on nothing in particular. That wool is going to travel a much longer road than this field. Before the year is out through hands we have not met yet into a trade, built almost entirely around needle thread, and a kind of patience most of us have completely lost the taste for. That wool will not travel far before it changes shape entirely, spun, woven, cut, and eventually finding its way into someone's actual wardrobe, which means it is time we followed it properly into a trade that touched more women in this city than almost any other single skill we have discussed tonight. We have already met the silk women, remember the ones weaving fine ribbon and cord destined for royal sleeves. This is a different, larger altogether, more ordinary world than theirs. Seamstresses cut and stitched entire garments from scratch shirts, shifts gowns working with plain wool and linen rather than imported silk, and doing it without the benefit of a single tool we would recognize today. No paper pattern pinned neatly to the fabric, no standardized sizing chart. Every garment was built by eye and by memory measured directly against the body. It was meant to fit cut with heavy shears that had to be sharpened by hand and sewn entirely by candlelight or daylight, whichever happened to be available that particular hour. Embroiderers added decoration to what the seamstress had already built. Birds' flowers, initials, entire scenes worked stitch by careful stitch into fabric that would otherwise have stayed plain. And somewhere underneath both of them sat the most basic, universal skill of all the kind almost every single girl in this country, rich or poor, noble or common, was expected to learn with a needle before she learned much of anything else. Let me introduce you to a woman whose arrival in London changed the entire silhouette of English fashion within a single generation, because her story tells you something important about how quickly one skilled outsider could reshape an entire industry. Her name was Dingen van der Plasse, and she came to London from Flanders in the year 1564, bringing with her a starch recipe considerably better than anything England had access to at the time. English starch, by most accounts, tended to come out cloudy grey, sometimes faintly gritty, the kind of finish that left a collar looking tired rather than crisp. Dingen's version came out clear fine, almost glass-like, and the difference showed the moment it dried on cloth. Within a short span of years, her small starch-making business had multiplied into workshops scattered right across the city, run by women she had personally trained, her particular technique spreading outward from her own workshop the way a single good recipe quietly reshapes an entire cuisine. The reason for that sudden explosion was sitting right there on everyone's collar. You know the look, even if you have never once used the word ruff before tonight, that enormous stiff-pleated white collar that seems to swallow the entire lower half of a face in almost every Elizabethan portrait you've ever seen. That look did not exist, at least not in its most extravagant form, until Dingen's starch made it physically possible. Before her arrival, collars sagged. They wilted. They simply could not hold the kind of dramatic sculptural shape that later became the single most recognizable symbol of the entire era. One properly starched ruff by the height of the fashion could swallow up to 6 yards of the finest linen, folded into as many as 600 individual pleats, extending outward from the neck by 8 inches or more on the most extravagant examples worn at court. 600 pleats on a single collar, around a single neck. Think about the sheer number of hours that represents multiplied across every fashionable household in the country, and you start to understand why an entire specialized trade grew up around something as seemingly small as a stiffened piece of cloth. Not everyone welcomed this new obsession, and the criticism it drew tells you something worth pausing on about class and appearance in this period. One of the Queen's own senior advisers publicly grumbled that it seemed a shame to spend good grain on starching collars for the wealthy, while ordinary people went hungry in the streets for want of bread, a complaint that lands with a slightly uncomfortable familiarity if you have ever scrolled past a headline about luxury spending during hard economic times. He was not entirely wrong to worry about it either. Starch was made from the same wheat that fed the poor, and every sack diverted towards stiffening a nobleman's collar was quite literally a sack that did not end up in someone's bread oven that winter. And yet, for all his public grumbling, nobody with real power actually stopped buying the stuff. The ruff kept growing year after year, wider and more elaborate, precisely because it had become such an obvious, unmistakable marker of wealth that abandoning it would have meant quietly admitting you could no longer afford to look important. Fashion then as now always had a cost that extended well past whoever happened to be wearing it, and complaining about that cost from a position of comfort has never once actually slowed it down. Behind every one of those elaborate collars stood women doing the actual physical work of creating them, heating small iron rods called poking sticks over a low fire, then using them to press each individual pleat into place by hand, one careful fold at a time, close enough to an open flame that a single moment of distraction could cost her a burn or ruin, an entire morning's work in an instant. The rods themselves needed to stay hot enough to set the starch firmly, but never so hot they scorched the delicate linen, a balance judged entirely by feel, by the particular hiss and smell of fabric, meeting heated metal skill that no written instruction could fully teach. Set the pleats too loosely, and the whole elaborate structure sagged by midday, embarrassing everyone who had paid handsomely for it. It was skilled, precise, occasionally dangerous labour performed almost entirely by women, and it earned Dingen van der Plas enough of a reputation that fashionable London sent its finest linen directly to her workshop, rather than trust the job to anyone less practised. An immigrant woman arriving in a country not her own ended up quietly dictating the exact shape English nobility wore around its throat for the better part of 2 generations. I do not think that story gets told nearly often enough. Embroidery, meanwhile, occupied a strange and slightly more complicated position than either starching or plain sewing, because unlike almost every trade we have looked at tonight, it was not neatly claimed by one gender alone. A formal guild of professional embroiderers did exist in London, working the most valuable commissions, church vestments, royal garments, ceremonial banners, and its most senior best-paid members tended overwhelmingly to be men trained through the same kind of formal apprenticeship system that governed goldsmiths or mercers, with contracts, wages, and eventual guild membership all properly recorded. But step outside that narrow official guild structure, and embroidery told an entirely different story. One practiced daily by women of every social class in every parlour and cottage across the country, almost none of it ever passing through any guild hall at all. A noblewoman embroidering her own gown, a merchant's daughter stitching a christening cloth, a farmer's wife decorating a coif in whatever spare hour the day allowed her. None of these women needed anyone's permission or membership to pick up a needle. 2 completely different economies really operating side by side under the exact same needle and thread, one formal male and well documented, the other informal female and almost entirely invisible to the official record. Which version do you suppose actually produced more embroidered cloth across the country? In any given year, I would put real money on the one nobody bothered writing down, because needlework in its most basic form was not really optional for a Tudor girl of any class. It sat right alongside reading and prayer as one of the very first skills a young girl was expected to master, practiced for hours at a time, usually taught by a mother, an older sister, or a household servant with steadier hands than her own. Long before a girl was old enough to attempt an actual garment, she would practice on smaller, less consequential pieces of cloth, working the same handful of stitches over and over until her fingers no longer needed her eyes to guide them. And it is worth remembering that this particular skill carried a double life. Most of the trades we have discussed tonight did not. On one hand, it was pure necessity mending torn hems, patching worn elbows, keeping a family clothed on a budget that left no room for waste. On the other, in whatever narrow margin of free time a woman actually had, it became one of the only creative outlets available to her at all, a place to choose her own colours, her own patterns, her own small flourishes of personality on cloth that belonged entirely to her hands, even when almost nothing else in her legal life did. A queen might commission an embroiderer for political symbolism stitched into a formal gown. An ordinary woman might simply choose a flower she liked the look of purely because she liked the look of it, and stitch it into a coif nobody outside her own household would ever closely examine. Both were the exact same skill, aimed at two entirely different purposes, and I think that quiet freedom, however small, mattered more to the women practicing it than most of us give it credit for today. And this is where I want to slow down and show you something rather than simply tell you about it, because a genuine physical piece of this exact tradition still exists today sitting behind protective glass in a museum in London. In the year 1598, a young woman named Jane Bostock sat down and stitched a long narrow band of linen covered in careful rows of alphabet letters, small animals, flowers and family crests working in silk thread, tiny seed pearls and delicate metal thread alongside it, a small dog on a lead, a lion standing watchfully upright, a deer resting quietly among the foliage. Near the top, in small deliberate stitches, she recorded exactly what the piece commemorated: the birth of her young cousin Alice Lee, born 2 years earlier on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Some of the motifs she stitched were pulled directly from her own family's crest, others from Alice's side of the family woven together on the same piece of cloth the way a family tree might be woven together on paper, except stitched in silk instead of ink meant to be touched and kept, rather than simply read. It survives today as the earliest dated sampler ever found in this country, a piece of embroidery that was never meant to end up in a museum at all, simply a personal gift, a private record of family love and skill, stitched by one specific named ordinary young woman whose full name has managed to survive 500 years intact. She was not a queen. She was not a merchant's wife with her name recorded in a guild ledger. As best historians can tell, she may simply have been a relative living within the household, valued enough for her steady hand with a needle to be trusted with a gift, this personal, this permanent. I find something quietly moving in that, especially after everything else we've talked about tonight. The midwife who delivered a Tudor princess has no name at all in the record books. The dairymaid pressing her whole body weight onto a cheese mould left behind nothing we can point to and say she made this exact object with her own 2 hands. But Jane Bostock did entirely by accident, simply because she happened to stitch her own name into a private gift for a cousin she loved, never once imagining anyone outside her own family would ever see it, let alone that people 5 centuries later would be studying the exact stitches she chose, one by one, trying to understand a little more about how she lived. Sit with that difference for a moment, because I think it says something true about how history actually gets preserved. It was rarely the most important women whose names survived. It was more often than not simply the ones who happened to leave behind an object, a will, a signature, something physical enough to outlast them sitting in exactly the right cousin's attic for exactly enough generations. How many other Jane Bostocks do you suppose existed across this same century, just as skilled, just as loving toward their own families, whose particular scrap of linen simply did not survive the centuries in between, lost to damp, to fire, to a house, eventually cleared out by descendants who never knew what they were throwing away? It makes me wonder honestly what any of us are quietly leaving behind right now without realizing it. Some small, ordinary object that means nothing to anyone else in the room tonight, and yet might be the one single thing that survives long enough to tell a stranger centuries from now that we are here, that we were skilled at something, that we loved somebody enough to make them a gift with our own 2 hands. Jane Bostock certainly never sat down that year thinking she was making history. She was simply making something beautiful for a cousin she loved. Not far from where the needlewomen sit, stitching by whatever light the morning offers, tucked into a narrow house at the edge of town, a very different kind of skill is being practiced this same morning, one involving crushed leaves, simmering roots, and a working knowledge of the human body that no university in the country would have ever let a woman formally study. It is there we're headed next, into a trade that walked the thinnest, most dangerous line of anyone we've met so far tonight. Inside that narrow house, the air smells nothing like the dairy field or the starching workshop we just left behind. Dried bundles hang from the ceiling beams in loose, careful rows, lavender yarrow, something faintly bitter I cannot quite name from here, and a small fire keeps a blackened pot simmering low and slow in the corner. Jars line a shelf along the far wall, some labelled in a shorthand. Only she could read others, simply recognisable to her by shape, colour and smell alone. An older woman moves between the bundles with the unhurried confidence of someone who's done this exact routine 10,000 times before crushing a few dried leaves between her fingers, testing the smell, adding them to the pot without once needing to measure anything. Nobody trained her in a lecture hall or handed her a certificate for any of this. She learned the way almost every woman we have met tonight learned her particular trade, at the elbow of someone older, most likely her own mother or grandmother, watching for years before she was ever trusted to measure a dose herself. A wrong guess with foxglove, remember, could just as easily stop a heart as steady one, which meant her early years of training carried real consequences long before she was considered ready to treat a patient alone. There was no room in this trade for careless guessing, whatever outsiders assumed about mysterious old women mixing things by superstition rather than skill. Villagers call her the wise woman, sometimes the cunning woman, and this morning, like most mornings, a small line of people has already started forming outside her door before she has even finished her tea. A child with a persistent cough, a farmer worried about a swelling on his leg, a young wife hoping for something to ease the sickness of an early pregnancy, an old man simply wanting someone to look at a wound that refuses to close properly. None of them can afford or even reach a university-trained physician, and honestly, most of them would not particularly want to, not when the nearest one lived half a day's journey away, and charged fees that would swallow a month's wages for a single consultation. What she offers is faster, cheaper, close enough to walk to, and more often than you might expect, considerably more effective. Let's clear something up straight away, because popular imagination tends to flatten this entire role into one single image, hunched sinister, stirring something unpleasant in a cauldron. In reality, the practice she represents split cleanly into two very different categories under the law and in the minds of ordinary people. There was maleficium, harmful magic, curses, poisonings, deliberate misfortune inflicted on a neighbour's cattle, or a rival's health, the kind of thing whispered about, fearfully rather than requested openly. And then there was everything she is doing this morning, healing, protecting, comforting, easing, a difficult birth, blessing, a sickly newborn, finding a lost object, occasionally even identifying who might have cursed a neighbour in the first place, the kind of practical, beneficial work an entire village depended on, and crucially was perfectly happy to pay for, sometimes even proudly, the way you might recommend a trusted doctor to a friend today. Here is a detail that tends to sharply surprise people once they hear it, because it cuts directly against almost everything popular culture has trained us to assume. Historians combing through surviving records from this period have found that a striking majority of the people practicing this kind of protective, beneficial magic, the cunning folk properly consulted for healing or lifting a suspected curse, were actually men, not women. In one detailed regional study, roughly 7 out of every 10 identified cunning folk turned out to be male, which means the woman standing in front of that simmering pot this morning was in a strange, quiet way, the exception inside her own profession rather than its typical face. And yet when accusations of the darker version, the maleficium, the deliberate harm actually reached a courtroom, it was overwhelmingly women who ended up standing trial for it. Sit with that asymmetry for a moment, because I think it tells you something true about how suspicion actually moves through a community. The comforting, protective magic, the kind people openly sought out and gratefully paid for, carried surprisingly little stigma, and apparently did not threaten anyone's sense of order quite as sharply when a man was the one providing it, perhaps because a man offering a service still fit neatly enough into the world's existing expectations of him. But the moment something went wrong, a dead cow, a sick child, a failed harvest, and someone needed a person to blame, the finger swung disproportionately toward the women in the community who already lived slightly outside its usual boundaries, widowed, unmarried, elderly, poor, exactly the kind of woman with no husband's name standing between her and public suspicion, no household reputation large enough to shield her, the way it might shield a man doing identical work. It is a strange, almost mathematical unfairness once you lay it out plainly like that. Roughly the same skill set, roughly the same herbs, roughly the same whispered reputation for having a gift, ordinary people did not, and yet the risk attached to that gift landed overwhelmingly on one gender rather than the other, not because women practiced it more, but because women once accused had so much less standing left to defend themselves with. It is worth being clear that this is not simply the midwife we already met earlier tonight wearing a different apron. A midwife's world centered almost entirely on birth itself, that one specific dangerous passage a woman's body moved through. The wise woman's territory stretched far wider than that, covering nearly every illness, injury, and misfortune an ordinary household might face across an entire lifetime, from a teething infant to a dying grandparent, and everything uncomfortable or frightening that happened in between. Sometimes the same woman filled both roles in a small enough village simply because there was no one else available to fill either of them. More often they were understood as related but distinct callings, one focused on a single sacred threshold, the other responsible for guarding health across the whole of a person's remaining years. Now here is where I want to give you something concrete rather than simply abstract sympathy, because the herbal knowledge these women carried was not superstition dressed up as medicine. Willow bark chewed or brewed into a bitter tea for pain, and fever contains a compound called salicin, the same chemical family that would eventually give the world aspirin centuries after any wise woman ever picked a single strip of bark. Foxglove used carefully in tiny measured amounts to treat the kind of dangerous swelling we would now recognize as heart failure, contains compounds still prescribed today in a far more precisely measured form to steady failing hearts. Even something as ordinary as garlic recommended for wounds and infections she could not otherwise explain contains compounds modern researchers have since confirmed actually help fight certain bacteria. These were not lucky guesses stumbled into by accident. They were the accumulated result of generations of careful, repeated observation passed from an older woman to a younger one, tested quietly against real illness, in real bodies, long before anyone with a university degree thought a woman's kitchen might be worth taking seriously as a source of medical knowledge. Roughly 2 centuries after our morning in this cottage, an English physician studying heart disease would eventually credit an old woman's traditional remedy, one he described in his own writing simply as coming from an elderly woman in Shropshire, for pointing him toward foxglove as a treatment worth investigating properly. Before that, he admitted his own more conventional treatments had failed, the very patient this woman's family recipe went on to help. He spent years afterward carefully testing dosages, learning the hard way just how dangerous foxglove could be if measured wrong, since the very same compound that steadies a struggling heart can just as easily stop a healthy one if given carelessly, a fact any experienced wise woman would have already understood instinctively long before it ever appeared in a medical textbook. He built an entire respected medical career partly on a recipe that had already been quietly saving, or at least easing, lives in cottages exactly like this one for who knows how many generations before he ever wrote a single word of it down. It is a pattern we keep circling back to tonight in one form or another, isn't it? Knowledge carried faithfully by women for years, sometimes centuries before it becomes acceptable enough for someone else to formally claim polish and publish under his own name, none of which made the work itself remotely safe. The law watched this profession closely, and it watched with teeth. In the year 1542, during the reign of Henry VIII, England passed its very first formal statute, making witchcraft a capital crime punishable by death. Listing among its concerns the use of enchantments to find hidden treasure, provoke unlawful love, or cause bodily harm, worded broad enough to catch almost any form of folk practice a suspicious neighbour wanted to report. That particular law lasted only a handful of years before it was quietly repealed following the king's death, and for roughly a decade and a half afterward, such accusations reverted to the slower, quieter machinery of church courts rather than the Crown's own justice. It returned in an even more carefully structured form in 1563, early in Elizabeth's reign, this time dividing the crime by severity in a way the earlier law never had. Witchcraft that caused a death carried the penalty of hanging. Witchcraft that caused lesser harm, a ruined crop, a sickened animal, a neighbour's unexplained illness, carried a year in prison, along with repeated public appearances in the pillory, a second offence of that kind bringing the same hanging that murder by witchcraft always carried. The wise woman treating a cough this morning, and the witch accused of cursing a cow, were in the eyes of the law standing disturbingly close to the exact same line, separated mainly by which of her neighbours decided to speak up against her and why. That danger was never hypothetical. In the town of St. Osyth in the year 1582, a woman named Ursula Kemp, known locally for exactly this kind of healing work, tending the sick, easing childbirth, occasionally treating ailments. Other people in the village could not, was accused by her neighbours of causing harm through witchcraft. The accusations spiralled quickly, as they so often did, once the first name was spoken aloud, drawing in old grudges, old debts, old suspicions that had apparently been quietly waiting for exactly this kind of excuse to surface. Ursula Kemp was executed for it. The very same skills that made a woman like her truly valuable to her community, an intimate knowledge of the body of illness of which remedy eased, which symptom could just as easily be reinterpreted as evidence against her, the moment a neighbour's fear needed somewhere specific to land. Skeletons later uncovered in that same town, believed by many researchers to belong to women executed in these very trials, were found with iron pins driven through their joints, a precaution some communities took against a suspected witch, supposedly rising from her grave, a small chilling detail that tells you just how far this particular fear was willing to travel even past the grave itself. I keep coming back to the particular cruelty buried inside that arrangement. She was often the person a frightened village turned to first, when they suspected a curse had already been laid on them, the one asked to identify who might be responsible, to offer protection, to set things right. In a very real sense, she stood as the community's first line of defence against exactly the kind of accusation that could on a different day, under different circumstances, be turned squarely against her instead. Hunter and hunted, standing in the same worn pair of shoes, depending entirely on which direction the village happened to be looking that particular week. The very people she had spent years quietly healing were in many documented cases the same people who eventually turned and pointed a finger back at her, not necessarily out of malice, but out of the same fear that had sent them to her door in the first place, now aimed inward instead of outward. Ask yourself honestly tonight, tucked safely under your own blankets, whether you would have had the nerve to keep doing this work at all, knowing exactly how thin that line was and how little control you actually had over which side of it you might end up standing on by winter. I'm not entirely sure I would have. And yet women like her kept opening their doors every single morning anyway, because somewhere in that narrow house, a farmer's leg still needed tending, and a young wife still needed reassurance nobody else in the village was qualified or willing to give her. She is not married, this particular wise woman, and has not been for some years now, ever since her husband passed. It is worth noticing that plenty of women in this exact profession share that in common with her unattached independent, answering to no husband's name or permission, often turning to healing precisely because widowhood had left them needing some way to support themselves that did not depend on anyone else's income. Losing a husband, as strange as it sounds, opened doors for a Tudor woman that marriage had always kept firmly closed, and it is precisely that strange quiet reversal we are walking toward next, into the surprising, occasionally freeing world of what happened to a woman once she became a widow. Widowhood, as strange as this sounds to say out loud, was one of the few genuine plot twists available to a Tudor woman, a single event capable of completely rewriting everything about her legal existence overnight. One day she belonged in the eyes of the law almost entirely to her husband, her property, her voice in court effectively borrowed rather than her own, her very identity folded quietly into his for as long as the marriage lasted. The next, if he happened to die first, she woke up as something closer to her own person than she had likely ever been allowed to be before sometimes, for the very first time in her adult life. Here is the mechanism that made it possible, and it has nothing to do with the femme soul trading status we talked about earlier tonight. This was something older, broader, and available to widows regardless of whether they had ever run a business of their own, whether she lived in London or in the smallest village in the country. It was called dower, and by long-established custom across the country, a widow was entitled to a full third of her late husband's estate for the remainder of her own life, the income, the rents, sometimes the use of specific houses or land set aside for exactly this purpose. She could not sell it outright. She could not will it away to someone else when she herself eventually died, since it was always meant to pass back to her husband's heir once she was gone. But for as long as she lived, that third belonged to her, hers, to spend hers, to manage hers, to make decisions about without asking a single man's permission first. Whether that meant paying off debts, funding a comfortable old age, or as one particular widow eventually proved, building an entire fortune from almost nothing at all. Let me show you exactly what that could mean in practice, because one woman's life traces the entire arc of this system more clearly than almost anyone else's from the period. She was born into a minor, only moderately wealthy family in Derbyshire, and by the time she was in her early teenage years she'd already been married off to a boy barely older than herself, a common enough arrangement for families looking to secure whatever advantage they could through a good match. Within a year her young husband was dead, and the teenage widow found herself entitled to a third of his income as her dower. Her brother-in-law, who stood to inherit the rest, simply refused to pay it, likely assuming a grieving teenage girl with no husband to speak for her would quietly let the matter drop rather than cause trouble. He assumed wrong. She did something that tells you everything you need to know about the woman she was about to become. Rather than quietly accept the refusal as many women in her position might have felt forced to, she took her own brother-in-law to court fighting for money that was legally hers, and after a lengthy battle she won. It was not a fortune, not yet just an annual income modest enough that it would never have made headlines on its own, but just enough to give a 17-year-old girl a small genuine taste of financial independence, years before most women her age would ever experience anything like it. Her name was Bess of Hardwick, and that stubborn court victory over a small dower payment turned out to be only the very first chapter of one of the most remarkable financial rises of the entire Tudor century. Bess went on to marry 3 more times across her long life, and here is the part that truly fascinates me. Each time she was widowed, her wealth grew rather than shrank because each husband left her another dower portion, layered on top of everything she had already accumulated. A wealthy second husband left her an income that, converted into modern terms, would sit comfortably in the millions, along with 6 surviving children who would go on to found some of England's most enduring aristocratic dynasties. A third husband, whose own family suspected he had been poisoned by a jealous younger brother, eager to protect his own inheritance, left his entire estate directly to her rather than dividing it among distant relatives. By the time her 4th and final husband died, Bess of Hardwick had become, by most contemporary accounts, the 2nd wealthiest woman in the entire kingdom, outranked only by the Queen herself. She spent the final years of her life doing something almost no other widow in this story has had the resources to do, building an enormous architecturally daring house entirely on her own terms, its towers famously carved with her own initials, rather than any husband's name visible for miles across the Derbyshire countryside to this very day, a permanent physical signature on the landscape belonging to a woman who once had to sue her own family simply to collect a small annual income owed to a grieving teenage bride. Ask yourself honestly, if you'd been handed that same brutal lesson at 17 watching a brother-in-law try to cheat you out of money that was rightfully yours, would you have folded quietly, or would you have come out the other side of that fight exactly as sharp and unforgiving as Bess clearly did? Now, widowhood did not only change a woman's income, it changed her legal personhood in ways that ran considerably deeper than money. Under the ordinary rules of marriage, a wife could not sue anyone in court, on her own could not be sued directly, either could not act as a fully independent party in almost any legal proceeding. Without her husband standing formally behind her, his name attached to hers on every document that mattered, a widow could do all of it entirely on her own signature. She could sue a debtor who owed her late husband money, and had been quietly hoping a grieving widow would not bother chasing it. She could be named executrix of his will, a role husbands assign their wives, constantly trusting them to settle debts, distribute property and manage an estate's final affairs, with a level of legal authority married women were never granted while their husbands still lived. Think about that trust for a moment. A man might spend his entire married life legally treating his wife as an extension of himself, and then in the very last document he ever signs, hand her sole responsibility for everything he leaves behind. Widows' records from this period show took full advantage of this appearing in significant numbers before England's law courts pursuing exactly these kinds of disputes, sometimes several cases at once defending property, chasing debts, contesting wills that shortchanged them. This did not always earn them warm applause. A widow who fought too visibly, too persistently, too successfully for what was legally hers risked a particular kind of criticism, reserved almost exclusively for women in her position, dismissed as outspoken, overbold, unbecoming, regardless of how airtight her legal claim actually was. Men bringing an identical lawsuit over an identical debt rarely faced that same commentary about their character. The law had handed her a genuine weapon. society still occasionally tried to shame her for daring to use it, whispering behind her back at exactly the same market stalls and church pews we have walked through all night, wondering aloud whether a woman so comfortable in a courtroom could really be trusted to know her proper place anywhere else. But I want to be honest with you about the darker corner of this system too, because dower rights were never quite as simple or as safe as they sound on the surface, especially for widows connected to land held directly from the crown. In the year 1540, Henry VIII established a new institution called the Court of Wards, specifically to manage what happened to an underage heir when his father died holding land under this particular kind of tenure. And what happened was, frankly, closer to a wealthy child being sold off as a business opportunity than anything resembling protection. The Crown claimed the right to nearly all the income from that estate until the heir came of age at 21 for a boy, 14 for a girl, and that valuable right of wardship was then typically auctioned off to whichever wealthy buyer offered the most money for it, a buyer who now controlled the orphaned child's upbringing, education, and quite often their eventual choice of marriage partner as well. It was in effect a thriving government business built entirely around profiting from grief, and men across the country actively competed for the privilege of buying a stranger's dead father's leftover authority. Where did that leave the widowed mother in all of this? Standing on the sidelines watching a stranger who had simply outbid everyone else make decisions about her own child's life, entitled only to a usual third of the estate, while someone she may never have met before profited handsomely from the other 2/3 until her son or daughter finally grew old enough to inherit what should have already been theirs. Some widows fought this system through the courts, too occasionally with success, more often exhausting years and considerable expense chasing a wardship. They had very little real chance of winning back from a buyer with deeper pockets and better connections than her own. It is a deeply uncomfortable thing to sit with, isn't it, realizing that even a legal system generous enough to hand a widow real independence over her own money could in the very same breath strip her of any meaningful say over her own children the moment enough money was involved. I find myself wondering what it must have felt like sitting across a table from the man who had legally purchased authority over your own son, forced to be polite to him, perhaps even grateful to him, simply because losing his goodwill could cost her whatever access to that child she still had left. And this is precisely where I think we need to be careful not to romanticize widowhood into something it was not for every single woman who experienced it. Bess of Hardwicke's story works because Bess of Hardwicke had property substantial enough to fight for in the first place, and because she happened to possess exactly the kind of stubborn, unyielding temperament that particular fight required. A poorer widow left with a dying husband's debts rather than his wealth frequently found herself with nothing resembling independence at all, simply a smaller mouth to feed and considerably less social protection than she'd enjoyed as a married woman only days earlier. There was no dower worth chasing through the courts when there was nothing substantial left in the estate to begin with, only a cottage, a few tools, perhaps a debt or two her husband had quietly left unpaid. For women at that end of the social scale, widowhood often meant turning to exactly the kinds of trades we've already spent this entire night discussing. Brewing a little extra ale, taking in mending, selling whatever skills she had simply to keep herself fed through the following winter. Widowhood was not one universal experience quietly waiting to liberate every woman who fell into it. It was a lottery, its outcome determined almost entirely by how much property her husband happened to leave behind, and how willing she turned out to be to fight for whatever share of it the law actually promised her. There is one more strange twist worth mentioning before we move on tonight. A widow with a healthy dower income suddenly became remarkably attractive on what people at the time bluntly called the marriage market, and this time Unlike her first marriage arranged so often by parents while she was barely more than a child herself, she frequently had genuine say in who, if anyone, she chose to marry next. Some widows remarried within months, drawn by companionship practicality, or simply the desire not to manage an estate entirely alone. Others, having finally tasted what real independence actually felt like, after years of having none, quietly chose to stay exactly as they were for the rest of their lives. Thank you very much, answering to nobody, spending their own money on their own terms for as long as they possibly could. If a widow's dower alone could build something as extraordinary as the house Bess of Hardwick left behind her, it is worth pausing to ask what happened when the widow in question was not simply a wealthy gentlewoman, answerable to nobody but her own ambition, but the actual wife of a king suddenly holding, however briefly, genuine authority over the entire machinery of the state itself. Would that same fierce instinct for survival, the one that sent a 17-year-old girl into a courtroom against her own family, look any different sitting inside a royal council chamber instead of a country manor house? That particular version of a widowhood, and the strange, temporary power that came wrapped inside it, is exactly where we are headed next. The answer to that question arrives less than a decade into the reign we've been walking through tonight, and it arrives appropriately enough in the middle of a war nobody expected a queen to have to manage. It helps to know before we get there that Catherine was not stepping into completely unfamiliar territory. Earlier in the century, Henry VIII's own grandmother had wielded such extensive influence over the crown during her son's reign that later historians would eventually describe her as something close to an uncrowned queen in her own right, signing documents, shaping policy, and commanding a level of respect most men at court never dared question openly. That precedent mattered. It meant the idea of a formidable woman standing near or even briefly inside the machinery of English government was not entirely foreign by the time Catherine's own moment arrived, even if nobody had yet handed a queen quite this much direct official military authority before. In the summer of 1513, Henry VIII sailed for France, determined to win glory on a battlefield the way kings of that period were expected to. Before he left, he did something worth pausing on for a moment. He did not simply leave his council of elderly advisers in charge of England while he was away. He named his wife Catherine of Aragon, governor of the realm and captain general of the forces, a title that handed her direct formal authority over the defence of the entire kingdom on paper, every bit as real as the authority he carried with him across the Channel. She could summon troops, she could appoint sheriffs, she could sign warrants and draw funds directly from the royal treasury, all without needing anyone's counter-signature or approval. For a woman who had spent years of her marriage quietly managing court politics and religious devotion, this was an entirely different scale of responsibility, and by most contemporary accounts, she stepped into it with a confidence that surprised more than a few of the men left to advise her. Most of the time, a title like that would have meant quiet ceremonial paperwork and nothing more dramatic than reading reports and signing routine documents. Catherine had barely settled into the role when Scotland's King James IV, sensing an opportunity with England's own king and much of his army safely out of the country, declared war and marched his forces south across the border, breaking a peace treaty his own marriage to Henry's sister was supposed to guarantee. And here is where Catherine stopped being a placeholder and started actually governing. She ordered troops raised across the Midlands under martial law. She personally assembled a reserve army around London in case the northern defences failed. She rode north herself, several months pregnant at the time, reportedly in full armour to address the assembled troops before they marched to meet the invading Scots, a detail that tends to sit rather awkwardly against the popular image of a quiet, devout Spanish princess, embroidering by a window somewhere while men handled the real business of the kingdom. Whether she delivered the rousing battlefield speech later, chroniclers love to attribute to her word for word, is something historians still debate, but even her more sceptical biographers agree she made some kind of address to the reserve troops, and that the spirit behind it, urgent, commanding, entirely unwilling to simply wait passively for news from the front, was very much genuine to who she actually was in that moment. On the 9th of September that year, English forces under the Earl of Surrey met the Scottish army at Flodden in the north of England, and after several brutal hours of fighting, the Scots were devastated. King James IV himself was killed on the field, along with a staggering portion of his nobility, more than a dozen earls, several bishops, most of Scotland's military leadership wiped out in a single afternoon. Estimates of the dead on the Scottish side run into the thousands, dwarfing English losses by a wide margin. It remains by most measures one of the bloodiest single battles ever fought between these two kingdoms, and it happened entirely under the authority of a queen holding the throne together while her husband chased a comparatively minor victory in France. Catherine's own response to the news tells you almost everything about how she understood the moment. Rather than simply celebrating quietly, she wrote directly to Henry gently, but unmistakably reminding him that this victory at home outweighed anything he had achieved abroad, telling him plainly that Flodden had brought more honour to his realm than winning the entire crown of France ever could. Along with her letter, she sent him a trophy, a piece of the dead Scottish king's own blooded coat meant for his battle banners. She had originally wanted to send something far more dramatic, still the king's actual body, before deciding in her own words that English hearts would not bear it. Sit with that for a second. A queen regent several months pregnant, casually weighing whether or not to ship a dead monarch's corpse to her husband as a war trophy, then settling for a blood-stained coat instead as the more restrained option. That is not the passive, ornamental image of Tudor queenship most of us were handed by textbooks and costume dramas. It is worth remembering too that her personal story that same autumn carried real sorrow. Alongside the triumph since the pregnancy she carried through the campaign, ended as so many did in this period in the loss of the child not long afterward. She had commanded troops, organised supply lines and outmanoeuvred an invading army, all while carrying a child she would not in the end ever get to hold. Even a queen commanding a kingdom to victory could not command her own body. To cooperate, a reminder that every single woman we have spent tonight discussing, no matter how much power she temporarily held, was still living inside the same brutal reproductive odds we talked about earlier in this story. Power, it turns out, bought her an army. It could not buy her a single guarantee about her own body. Now Catherine was not simply a singular exception either. Decades later, when Henry sailed for France again in 1544, this time to besiege Boulogne, it was his final wife, Catherine Parr, who was named regent in his absence, overseeing the council, managing correspondence, corresponding directly with commanders in the field, and keeping the machinery of government running smoothly for the months he remained abroad. Her regency carried less drama than Catherine of Aragon's no invading army, no battlefield trophies, but it was in its own quieter way just as demanding, requiring the same steady judgment across 100 smaller decisions rather than one single dramatic crisis. And it confirms something important. Handing a queen genuine if temporary authority over the kingdom was not a strange one-off experiment England tried once and abandoned. It was by this point simply what a competent king did when he needed someone he trusted completely to hold the country together. In his absence, a quiet, practical acknowledgement that whatever the wider culture said about women and governance in theory and practice, the right woman could clearly be trusted with the entire kingdom. But here is the distinction I think matters most, and it is one worth sitting with carefully. Everything Catherine of Aragon and Catherine Parr exercised as regents was borrowed power granted by a husband revocable the moment he returned or the moment he simply changed his mind. It existed only because a king had decided for entirely practical reasons to lend it out temporarily, the way you might hand someone the keys to your house while you're away, fully expecting them back the moment you return. Compare that to what happened only a few years later when Mary and then Elizabeth inherited the throne outright, not as a wife holding power in trust for an absent husband, but as the actual legitimate sovereign monarch in her own right, with no king standing above her at all, no husband whose return would quietly restore the natural order everyone still expected. That was an entirely different and considerably more threatening proposition to the world around her. You can hear exactly how threatening in the reaction it provoked. In 1558, a Scottish preacher named John Knox, writing in frustrated exile, published a furious pamphlet aimed squarely at the very idea of a woman ruling in her own right, arguing that it defied both nature and scripture itself, that placing a woman above men in government was in his own blunt phrasing an offence against the natural order of the world. He had Mary I chiefly in mind when he wrote it, along with a handful of other Catholic queens he considered enemies of his faith, and by his own account he fully believed he was making an argument about theology and government rather than about women generally. His timing turned out to be almost unbelievably poor. The pamphlet reached print at almost the exact same moment Mary died, and her half-sister Elizabeth inherited the crown instead, meaning the new Protestant queen, a woman Knox actually supported on religious grounds, opened her reign already having been publicly declared unnatural by one of the era's most influential reformers. Elizabeth never forgave him for it, and honestly, why would she? He spent years afterward trying mostly in vain to explain that his argument had never been aimed at her specifically, but the damage to his standing in England was already permanent, his name effectively banned from crossing back into a country he still hoped to influence. It is a striking reminder that once an argument like that is set loose in print, it rarely stays neatly confined to whichever specific woman its author originally had in mind. Every queen who came after inherited a small piece of that suspicion, whether she had done anything at all to earn it. Elizabeth spent much of the rest of her reign carefully, deliberately answering that exact accusation, not through argument, but through performance. She leaned into martial language whenever the moment called for it, framing herself less as a delicate exception to the rule that women could not govern, and more as living proof the rule itself had simply been wrong all along. When the country later faced its own invasion threat from a Spanish fleet, rather than a Scottish army this time, she rode out to address her assembled troops in person, much the way Catherine of Aragon once had, deliberately drawing on the same physical visible courage that had made Flodden such an effective answer to doubt decades earlier. She understood better than almost anyone else in this story that reassuring words alone would never fully silence a man like Knox. Only the sight of her own body upright armoured standing in front of soldiers who might soon die defending her could do that particular job properly. Two queens, roughly 70 years apart, reaching for almost exactly the same tool, a horse, a uniform, a direct appearance in front of soldiers, because apparently that was still what it took to convince an entire kingdom a woman could actually be trusted with its safety. I keep coming back to the difference in what each kind of power actually cost the woman holding it. A regent's authority borrowed and temporarily drew relatively little formal backlash, precisely because everyone understood it would end the moment her husband walked back through the door, and normal order in the world's eyes would quietly reassert itself. A queen who held the throne outright, answerable to no husband standing above her, was a permanent challenge to the entire structure of the world around her, and she paid for that permanence in a way no regent ever quite had to, in pamphlets, in sermons, in a constant, exhausting requirement to keep proving a point her own brother had. She ever had one survive to inherit instead of her would never once have been asked to prove. Ask yourself honestly if the exact same battlefield victory at Flodden had been won under a queen who owned her crown outright, rather than one merely borrowing it for a season. Do you think history would have remembered her any differently, celebrated her any less cautiously? And if the answer is yes, what does that tell you about what people were actually afraid of in the first place? Was it really her competence anyone doubted, or simply how permanent that competence might turn out to be? A borrowed crown, after all, can always be quietly handed back. An owned one cannot, and that difference alone seems to have terrified an entire century of men, far more than any single battlefield ever could. For all that power, though real or borrowed, there was still an entire list of things. Not one of these women, not a regent, not a queen, regnant, not even the wealthiest widow in the entire kingdom, was ever legally permitted to do doors that stayed locked, no matter how high a woman managed to climb everywhere else, no matter how many battles she won, or how many pamphlets she outlived. It is time we finally looked squarely at that list. 4 doors specifically. 4 institutions this entire city quietly agreed no woman would ever be permitted to walk through, no matter how wealthy she became, no matter how many husbands she buried, no matter how many battles her own regency happened to win. Let's open each one, because the shape of what was forbidden tells you just as much about this world as everything we have already found a way inside of tonight, and honestly, it might tell you more. Start with the stage, because it is the one that tends to surprise people the most once they hear the actual details. Every single female role in every play performed publicly across this entire period, tragic queens, comic wives, tender young lovers, was written to be spoken by a boy, his voice not yet broken, his body dressed and painted to approximate womanhood, convincingly enough for an audience to accept it for a few hours. Somewhere in this very city tonight, a boy no older than 12 or 13 is probably rehearsing lines meant for a grown woman's mouth, and nobody watching him tomorrow will think that arrangement strange in the slightest. And here is the detail that completely upends what most people assume about this rule. There was no actual law forbidding women from performing on the English stage. Not one single statute anywhere on the book said the word woman and the word actress in the same breath. It was from start to finish purely a matter of custom reputation, an unspoken social consensus considered so completely beyond question that nobody in charge apparently felt the need to write it down formally at all. Compare that to the rest of Europe at the exact same moment, and the English position starts to look considerably stranger. In France, in Spain, in Italy, women performed professionally on stage throughout this same period, without triggering anything close to the same scandal English audiences would have expected their names appearing on playbills and their performances praised in exactly the same terms critics used for their male counterparts. Visiting companies occasionally brought that continental practice directly to English shores, and the reaction from London audiences and commentators tended toward open disapproval, treating foreign actresses less as fellow performers and more as a kind of moral curiosity worth gossiping about over supper. One English writer of the period, comparing local companies to those from overseas, took visible pride in the fact that English theatre kept itself free of exactly this kind of foreign indecency, as though the absence of women on stage were itself a mark of national virtue rather than simply an unexplained gap. So the obvious question worth sitting with for a moment is this: If women acting on stage was not against any actual law, and clearly was not considered scandalous just across the water in France or Italy, what exactly was England so afraid of losing? Women were not entirely absent from this industry, though, and the exact shape of their involvement tells its own story. They sewed and altered the costumes worn by the boy actors, playing their roles work that demanded exactly the same needle skill we spent an entire hour admiring earlier tonight. They sold food and drink to the crowds packed into the yard below the stage. Some even held ownership stakes in the playhouses themselves, collecting profits from an industry they were legally welcome to invest in but never permitted to physically stand inside as a performer, a peculiar arrangement that let a woman profit handsomely from every ticket sold to watch a boy pretend to be her, and a small handful of aristocratic women with enough social standing to absorb whatever raised eyebrows it caused, quietly wrote and translated plays of their own, intended strictly for private reading or performance, inside their own homes rather than any public stage. The words were entirely acceptable, apparently provided nobody but family, and invited guests actually watched a woman speak them out loud. The second door led into the law itself. 4 institutions in London known as the Inns of Court held an effective monopoly over training anyone who wished to argue cases before England's royal courts, and every single one of those doors was closed to women completely, no exception. No side entrance, no informal path around it. The way we found tucked into so many of the trades we have already explored tonight. A woman could not train as a barrister. She could not join the years of shared dining lectures and mock trials that turned an ambitious young man into a licensed advocate. She could not be called to argue a case on anyone's behalf but her own. And yet, as we already discovered a little earlier tonight, women appeared before England's courts in remarkable numbers. Anyway, defending dower rights, chasing debts, contesting wills, understanding the law well enough to use it aggressively in their own defence, occasionally outmanoeuvring the very men who assumed her unfamiliar with the system entirely. She could fight inside the system with everything she had. She simply could never be paid to fight it on behalf of anyone else. Never stand up in a courtroom wearing a barrister's gown and speak for a client who was not herself. The third door sat inside a university lecture hall, and this one might be the cruelest of the 4 because it had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with permission. Oxford and Cambridge, the only universities in the entire country at this time, admitted no female students whatsoever, regardless of intellect, family connections, or private education. Elizabeth herself could read and converse fluently in multiple classical and modern languages, a level of scholarship most university-educated men of her own court could not begin to match. And yet the Queen of England could not have enrolled as a student at either university, sitting only a short ride from her own palace. Her extraordinary education happened entirely through private tutors behind closed doors, personally arranged by a father determined his daughter be raised as intelligently as any prince, because the front door of formal academic life was simply not built with any woman in mind, crown or otherwise. Without a university degree, every profession built on top of one medicine law. Most branches of the clergy remained permanently out of reach. As well, an entire pyramid of closed doors stacked neatly on top of this single foundational one. The 4th door belonged to the church itself, though we've already glimpsed one narrow crack in it earlier tonight. No woman could be ordained, could preach from a pulpit, could hold any formal office inside the institution that shaped nearly every single aspect of daily Tudor life, from the calendar she followed to the language she used to mark birth, marriage, and death. The midwife's emergency baptism, remember, stood out precisely because it was the one singular, carefully bounded exception the church ever carved into that wall, a crisis measure, rather than a genuine invitation, granted only because the alternative and unbaptized soul lost forever was considered worse than briefly bending the rule. Outside of that one narrow moment, the pulpit, like the university lecture hall, like the barrister's bench, remained completely permanently closed, and with it every ounce of formal religious authority a person could otherwise hold in this deeply religious century. Layered on top of all four of these quietly but just as firmly sat the machinery of government itself. No woman voted. No woman sat in Parliament regardless of how much land she owned, or how many tenants paid rent directly into her own accounts. Most formal public offices, sheriff, justice of the peace alderman, stayed just as thoroughly closed even to widows, who had already proven themselves perfectly capable of managing estates, lawsuits, and entire households on their own. The one glaring exception standing at the very top of this whole structure, a queen actually wearing the crown, only makes the exclusion underneath her look stranger still. England could apparently trust a woman with the entire kingdom, yet not trust her with a single seat in the room where that kingdom's laws were actually written. Now here is the pattern I want you to notice, because I think it is the real thread running underneath everything we have explored across this entire night. Every single job we have spent hours walking through, together the silk trade, the alewife's kitchen, the dairy, the needle, the herbs, even the crown itself when it was only borrowed rather than owned outright. All of it operated through personal relationships, customary arrangements, individual reputation, a husband's trust, a queen's favour, a neighbour's word of mouth. These four forbidden doors were different in one crucial way. They were institutions, formal, credentialed, self-governing bodies, capable of handing someone a title that travelled with her, regardless of which household she belonged to, which man vouched for her, or which town happened to know her personally. A femme soul's independence lived and died with her, tied to her own name and her own reputation in her own city. Useless the moment she moved somewhere nobody knew her. A barrister's license, a university degree, an ordination, none of those depended on anyone's personal goodwill at all. Once granted, portable, permanent, recognised anywhere in the kingdom without a single character reference required. And that portable, self-sustaining kind of authority, the kind that did not need to be renewed by any man's continued approval every single time she walked into a new room, was apparently the one thing this entire system was never willing to hand a woman under any circumstances, no matter how competent she proved herself everywhere else. If you want to know exactly how long that particular shadow stretched, sit with this for a moment. Women were not permitted to train at England's Inns of Court until 1919, when a single new law finally forced those four ancient institutions to admit them as students for the first time in their entire history. Full university degrees, the actual formal qualification, rather than simply permission to sit in the room and take the exam without ever receiving anything. For it, were not granted to women at Cambridge until 1948, a date within living memory of some people's own grandparents. Read those two numbers again slowly. Not decades after the Tudor era ended, centuries. A woman standing in Cheapside this morning watching a silk woman negotiate with a royal servant or a widow win a lawsuit against her own brother-in-law was living inside a system so committed to keeping those four particular doors shut that it would take roughly 450 more years and 2 world wars before the last one finally grudgingly opened even partway, and even then only after considerable protest from the men determined to keep it closed a little longer still. I keep circling back to that number because I think it deserves more weight than a passing mention. We have spent this entire night finding loophole after loophole, workaround after workaround, women bending an unfair system just far enough to build real wealth, real skill, real quiet independence inside it. And I do not want that resilience to feel like the whole story, because it was not. Some doors simply did not bend. No amount of talent, no amount of stubbornness, no femme sole status or dower right or royal regency was ever going to talk a university into handing a woman a degree or a barrister's bench into handing her a case. Persistence is a truly inspiring thing to witness across history, and it is also sometimes simply not enough on its own, and I think it does these women a disservice to pretend otherwise, just to make the story feel a little more triumphant than it actually was. Some walls are not there to be climbed. They are simply there for centuries, until enough people on the outside finally agree to take them down brick by brick. So here is a question worth sitting with as we come to the end of this particular thread tonight. Of everything we have walked through the trades with clever loopholes and the doors that never once budged, which do you think was harder to live inside a system that occasionally let you in through the side, always reminding you the entry was a favour rather than a right, or one that told you plainly, permanently and in writing that the front door was never going to open at all, leaving no ambiguity to quietly hope against? We have covered a great deal of ground together tonight, from a cold market at dawn all the way to the locked doors of a university that would not open for centuries. It is almost time to leave this city and let its women rest, but before we do, there is one more stop worth making back to exactly where we started this whole journey, to ask what all of this actually adds up to, and which of these lives, given the choice you might have wanted for yourself. The light over Cheapside has changed completely since we first stepped into it this morning. That thin, weak tea colour has deepened into something warmer, heavier, the kind of late afternoon gold that makes even tired faces look a little softer than they actually feel. Shutters are starting to come down along the row of shops. The alewife has sold her last cup for the day and is already scrubbing out her barrel for tomorrow. Somewhere behind a window, a needle catches the last of the light one final time before it gets put away until morning. A cart rattles past empty. Now the goods it carried this morning already scattered into 100 different kitchens across the city. Even the smell of the street has changed, less bread and wood smoke, now more. The cooler, quieter scent of evening settling over cooling stone. And our girl, the one we left standing at that crossroads so many hours ago, ribbons on one side, ale on the other, is walking home now, basket a little lighter than it was at dawn, feet a little heavier. She still does not know exactly which path she will end up choosing for her own life. Most people her age never do not really not in any century. But she has spent a full day walking through a city that was, whether she ever fully realised it, or not, held upright almost entirely by women exactly like her. Women whose names mostly disappeared. Women whose work rarely disappeared at all. I want to walk back through some of what we found together tonight, not to repeat it. You were there for every step of it, but because a few of these threads keep tugging at each other in my mind, and I suspect they might be tugging at yours too. We met a silk woman who helped dress 4 different queens across an entire dynasty, who petitioned Parliament before women could vote on a single law, and still watched her own trade quietly slip into a guild hall with her name nowhere on the door. We met a midwife trusted with a newborn soul's passage into heaven, granted a kind of religious authority the church handed to no other woman anywhere, and still left almost entirely unnamed in the very records that paid her. We met a dairymaid whose careful repeated observations about cows and their strange gentle illness sat quietly in a milking shed for 2 centuries before a man with a medical degree finally turned that same folk knowledge into the world's first vaccine. 3 completely different women, 3 completely different trades, and somehow running underneath every single one of them, the exact same quiet pattern, extraordinary skill, real and undeniable, paired with almost no lasting credit for having it. We also spent time inside a royal household watching a woman climb from lady-in-waiting all the way to a queen's own privy chamber only to discover that the very closeness that made her valuable could just as easily make her a target the moment the political winds turned the way it eventually did for poor Jane Boleyn, who survived 4 different queens, only to be undone by the 5th. And we sat for a while in a small house at the edge of town, with a wise woman whose herbal knowledge could actually ease a fever or steady a failing heart, and who understood better than almost anyone else in this story that the very same skill which made her trusted on a good day could make her suspected on a bad one. That pattern is not an accident of history. I think it is closer to the actual thesis of everything we've spent this night uncovering together. Time after time, a woman built something valuable out of necessity, patience and skill nobody handed her, and time after time, right at the exact moment that skill became profitable or powerful enough to matter the door around it, quietly swung shut just before she could walk all the way through. We saw it happen to the silk women when men finally organised a guild the silk women themselves had never been permitted to build. We saw it happen to the alewives when hops and capital turned a kitchen trade into an industry that pushed them out entirely, their centuries of brewing knowledge quietly absorbed into businesses that no longer needed them. We saw it happen in its coldest, most permanent form in the university lecture halls and law courts that stayed locked for nearly half a millennium after everything else in this story took place. Doors that outlasted every single loophole we found, tucked into every other trade combined. And yet somehow that was never quite the whole story either. Because we also met a teenage widow who took her own brother-in-law to court over a dower payment and eventually became the second richest woman in the entire kingdom, building a house whose towers still carry her own initials centuries later. We met a queen who organised an army won one of the bloodiest battles in the history of 2 nations, and sent her husband a war trophy while she was several months pregnant, answering doubt not with argument but with a horse, a piece of armour and a battlefield. We met a young woman named Jane Bostock who sat down one ordinary year and stitched a gift for a cousin she loved, never imagining anyone beyond her own family would ever see it, and accidentally left behind one of the only truly personal intimate objects from an ordinary Tudor woman that has survived into our own century, completely intact, her actual name still legible in silk thread 500 years later. Competence and constraint sitting right next to each other in almost every single story we told tonight. Neither one cancelling the other out, both of them simply true at the same time the way most real history, if you look closely enough, usually turns out to be. I keep thinking about something we talked about earlier, the difference between a system that let a woman in sideways through a loophole, a custom, a kind husband's trust, and a system that told her plainly in writing that a particular door was never opening at all. I do not think there is a clean, comforting answer to which version was actually worse to live inside. I think both versions are something exhausting of the women living through them, constant vigilance in one case, quiet resignation in the other, and I think both versions still in different shapes are something exhausting of plenty of people today. So here is what I keep coming back to and what I want to leave sitting with you tonight right before you close your eyes. If you had been born into this particular city at this particular moment, and someone had walked you through everything we walked through, together the silk, the ale, the midwife's bag, the dairy, the needle, the herbs, the widow's fight, the queen's borrowed crown, which one would have actually called to you? Not which one sounds most impressive to say out loud tomorrow at breakfast, but which one, if you are honest with yourself, matches something already sitting quietly inside you. Maybe it is the silk woman's patience, the willingness to build something slow and precise, with your own 2 hands, year after year without needing an audience to notice. Maybe it is the widow's stubbornness, the refusal to quietly accept whatever smaller share the world hands you without at least asking why, even when asking costs you something. Maybe it is simply the wise woman's calm showing up for people on their worst day again and again, whether or not anyone ever properly thanks you for it, because the showing up mattered more to you than the thanks ever did. And maybe if you look closely enough, you already are one of them, just wearing different clothes, working under a different name in a century that likes to imagine it has left all of this behind. The quiet skill you have built through repetition nobody else witnessed. The small private income or independence you have carved out for yourself inside a system never quite designed with you in mind. The moment you fought for something that was legally obviously yours and had to fight harder than you should have simply to be taken seriously while doing it. History does not always repeat with a costume change this obvious, but I think more often than we like to admit it repeats anyway quietly in kitchens and offices and courtrooms that would look nothing like Cheapside and yet somehow still rhyme with it. Back on Cheapside, our girl reaches her own front door as the last of the light finally drains out of the sky. Somewhere inside, her mother is already banking the fire for the night, and her father is still frowning at that same stack of paperwork he was frowning at this morning, papers that will never carry his daughter's name no matter how capable her hands eventually become. She pulls off her cap, sets down her basket, and for one quiet moment before anyone calls her in for supper, she simply stands there in the last of the evening light, the whole strange, unfair, occasionally astonishing city humming faintly behind her. Tomorrow she'll likely wake up and do some version of exactly what she did today, help mind the shop, learn a little more of her mother's trade, watch the market, wake up around her one more time. Nothing about her circumstances will have changed overnight simply because we spent a few hours paying closer attention to the world she moves through. That is in its own way part of the point. Most of the women in this story never experienced a single dramatic turning point where everything suddenly became fair. They simply got up the next day and kept going the same way most of us do, building whatever small, stubborn version of a life the world was willing to let them have. She does not know any of the things we now know about her world. She does not know that centuries from now someone would sit in the dark describing her morning to strangers scattered halfway across the globe, all of them listening quietly under their own blankets, in their own particular version of this same soft fading light. She simply goes inside, closes the door behind her, and lets the day end the way most days end, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone writing it down. That more than anything else might be the truest thing we found tonight. Not the silk, not the crown, not even the 4 doors that stayed shut for centuries. Just this, an entire city, an entire century, held together by exactly this kind of ordinary, unrecorded, thoroughly extraordinary woman walking home in the last of the light, expecting no one to remember her name and mattering enormously anyway. If she could somehow know that 500 years later, a stranger would spend an entire evening making sure people remembered her anyway, I think it might be the only ending to her story that would have actually surprised her. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, and for letting this particular city and these particular women keep you company as the rest of your evening quietly settles in. Whether you came here straight from a long day of your own, or simply because you needed something gentle playing in the background, while your mind finally let go of everything it was holding on to, I am glad you found your way here. If any part of tonight's story stayed with you, the silk, the widow, the queen, with her borrowed crown, I would love to know which one when you wake up and have a moment to think about it. And if you found yourself drifting off somewhere along the way, well before Cheapside even finished waking up this morning, that is exactly where this story was always meant to take you. So rest well, and do not feel the slightest need to fight it. There is another city, another century, and another set of women waiting for us the next time we do this together. Quieter streets, different trades, entirely new names worth learning, and I already cannot wait to introduce you to them. I do not know exactly which corner of history we will wander into next, only that it will be told with the same care, the same patience, and hopefully the same soft light we've been sitting inside together tonight. Until then, keep this evening close. Let the rest of the noise in your day quiet itself down completely and sleep easy. I will see you again very soon.